My rich wife, the CEO, threw me out after believing her sister's lies. 3 weeks later, she asked if I'd reflected instead. I handed her divorce papers. Her sister lost it. You know how they say hindsight's 20/20? Well, let me tell you something. Sometimes you can see the train wreck coming from a mile away, but you're too damn stubborn to get off the tracks. That's basically the story of my life, or at least the 44 years leading up to this spectacular mess I'm about to lay on you. My name's Marcus Hale, and up until about 3 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream. Picture this: a decent-looking guy with a solid career in project management, married to one of the most powerful women in the city. Clara Whitmore. Yeah, that Whitmore, the one whose face graces the cover of Forbes every other month, was my wife. CEO of Whitmore Luxury Real Estate, a company that basically owns half the prime real estate from Manhattan to the Hamptons. When people heard I was married to Clara Whitmore, their jaws would hit the floor so hard you could hear the thud from 3 blocks away. On paper, we were absolutely perfect. She brought the big bucks, the connections, the kind of influence that gets you tables at restaurants that don't even have names on their doors. Me? I brought stability, reliability, and what she used to call that charming everyman quality that keeps me grounded. Translation: I was the normal guy who made her feel like she wasn't completely living in an ivory tower made of $100 bills. Our wedding photos looked like something straight out of Architectural Digest. Her penthouse overlooking Central Park, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating above the peasants below. The marble kitchen island cost more than most people's cars, and don't even get me started on the wine cellar that housed bottles worth more than my college education. Clara would joke that marrying me was the best investment she'd ever made, and I'd laugh along, thinking she meant it in the sweet, romantic way couples talk about being each other's better halves. Spoiler alert, she didn't. But here's where our fairy tale takes a hard left into nightmare territory. See, Clara had this younger sister, Sabrina Whitmore, and if Clara was the golden child who could do no wrong, then Sabrina was the family's professional disappointment wrapped in designer clothes and an attitude that could curdle milk. Sabrina was 28, unemployed by choice, and had perfected the art of living off her sister's generosity like it was an Olympic sport. She had this whole setup going. Clara paid for her Manhattan apartment, her credit cards, her gym membership, her therapy sessions, her organic juice cleanses, and probably her monthly manicures that cost more than some people spend on groceries. Sabrina liked to call it family support, but the rest of us called it what it was, freeloading with a trust fund twist. From day one, Sabrina looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in during her morning jog through Central Park. Not that she actually jogged. Physical exertion was beneath someone of her refined sensibilities. But you get the picture. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual drop-by visit, she'd give me this look. You know the one. Like she was mentally calculating exactly how much of her sister's money I was going to cost them over the years. The thing about Sabrina was that she had this talent for making her poison sound like concern. Clara, honey, don't you think Marcus seems a little too comfortable with your lifestyle? She'd say, her voice dripping with fake worry. I mean, it's so sweet how he's adapted to luxury so quickly. Almost like he was born for it, you know? And Clara, bless her brilliant but naive heart, would just nod along like Sabrina was dropping profound wisdom instead of passive-aggressive grenades designed to blow up my marriage from the inside. The dinner table conversations became my personal hell. Picture this scene. Clara at the head of the table, discussing her latest multi-million-dollar deal while casually sipping wine that cost more per bottle than most people make in a week. Me, trying to contribute something meaningful to the conversation while simultaneously wondering if my middle-class background was written all over my face like a scarlet letter. And Sabrina, sitting there with that smirk. Oh, that damn smirk, like she knew something the rest of us didn't. Marcus, tell us about your day, Sabrina would say with fake sweetness, and somehow she'd make it sound like she was asking me to explain quantum physics to a toddler. Did you manage any interesting projects today? Nothing too stressful, I hope. We wouldn't want you getting overwhelmed. The subtext was always there, thick as molasses. You don't belong here. You're not good enough for my sister. You're just another gold digger with better manners. And slowly, painfully, I started to notice Clara changing. The woman who used to look at me like I hung the moon began studying my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Her laugh became more polite than genuine. Her questions about my work started sounding less like interest and more like interrogation. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Became, "So what exactly did you accomplish today?" The shift was subtle at first, like watching paint dry or grass grow, but it was there. Every conversation felt like I was being cross-examined by a prosecutor who'd already decided I was guilty. Sabrina was a master manipulator, the kind of person who could plant seeds of doubt so skillfully that you'd swear they grew there naturally. She never outright accused me of anything. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she'd make these little comments, these tiny suggestions that burrowed into Clara's brain like psychological termites. "I just worry about you sometimes, Clara," she'd say during their sister bonding sessions that I wasn't invited to. "You're so trusting, so generous. Some people might take advantage of that beautiful heart of yours." And Clara, who could spot a bad business deal from a mile away, who could negotiate million-dollar contracts in her sleep, somehow couldn't see that her own sister was playing her like a fiddle. The worst part? I could see it happening. Every single day, I watched my marriage crumble one whispered conversation at a time, one raised eyebrow, one perfectly timed sigh from Sabrina. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash where you're the passenger and someone else is driving straight toward the guardrail. I tried talking to Clara about it once. Big mistake. Huge. She looked at me like I'd just suggested her sister was running a meth lab out of her Park Avenue apartment. "Sabrina loves me, Marcus. She's just looking out for me. Maybe if you tried harder to understand her instead of always being defensive." That's when I realized I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. Because in Clara's mind, I was the outsider, the variable that didn't quite fit the equation of her perfect life. Sabrina had been there first, had 28 years of history and shared memories and inside jokes. I had 3 years of marriage and a growing reputation as the paranoid husband who couldn't handle his sister-in-law's honest concern. But here's what neither of them knew. I might have been the stable, reliable, everyman husband, but I wasn't stupid. And I sure as hell wasn't going down without a fight. They thought they had me figured out. They thought I'd just roll over and accept whatever fate they decided for me. Boy, were they wrong. If I thought Chapter 1 was bad, let me tell you about the masterclass in psychological warfare that Sabrina put on during the following months. This woman didn't just thrive on drama. She practically had a PhD in it. I'm talking about someone who could create conflict in an empty room and somehow make it everyone else's fault. You ever meet someone who treats lying like an art form? That was Sabrina Whitmore in a nutshell. She didn't just tell lies. She crafted them, polished them, and served them up with such conviction that you'd start questioning your own memories. It was honestly impressive in the most terrifying way possible. The affair accusations started on a Tuesday. I remember because I was supposed to meet Clara for lunch at that overpriced bistro she loved downtown. The kind of place where they charge $30 for a salad and call it artisanal. I was running late from a client meeting when my phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Rain check on lunch." Need to think about some things Sabrina told me. Some things Sabrina told her. Those 6 words should have come with a hazmat warning because they were about to poison everything we'd built together. When I got home that evening, the temperature in our penthouse felt like it had dropped about 20 degrees. Clara was sitting in her favorite chair, the white leather monstrosity that cost more than most people's monthly rent. With this look on her face like she'd just discovered I'd been running a human trafficking ring out of our spare bedroom. "We need to talk," she said. And brother, if you've ever been married, you know those 4 words are basically the relationship equivalent of code red. All hands on deck. Prepare for impact. "Sure, babe. What's up?" I said, trying to keep things light while my stomach was doing gymnastics routines that would make an Olympic athlete jealous. Clara took a deep breath. The kind you take before you jump off a cliff or tell someone their dog died. "Sabrina saw you having lunch with a woman today. A blonde woman. At Cafe Milano." Now, here's where it gets absolutely ridiculous. First off, I wasn't at Cafe Milano. I was in a conference room with 3 middle-aged guys discussing pipeline schedules for a construction project. Second, the only blonde I'd interacted with all day was the barista at Starbucks who spelled my name, Marcus, despite me spelling it out for her. But Sabrina had planted this seed, and Clara was already nurturing it like it was going to bloom into a beautiful garden of justified suspicion. "Clara, honey, I was in meetings all day. I can show you my calendar, my emails. Hell, I can probably get security footage from my office building if you want. But here's the thing about Sabrina's lies. They were never just about the facts. They were about creating an atmosphere, painting a picture, building a narrative where I was the villain and she was the concerned sister trying to save Clara from heartbreak. It's not just today, Marcus, Clara said, and I could practically hear Sabrina's voice coming out of her mouth. She's been noticing things. The way you've been dressing better lately. How you've been staying late at work more often. The fact that you've been more attentive to your appearance. I stared at her like she'd just told me the earth was flat and birds were government surveillance drones. You mean I've been dressing better because you bought me better clothes? And staying late because we landed 3 new major clients? And taking care of my appearance because I'm married to one of the most successful women in the city and I don't want to embarrass you at business functions. But logic doesn't work when someone's already decided you're guilty. Clara had that look in her eyes, the same one she got when she was closing a particularly difficult real estate deal. She'd made up her mind, and now she was just looking for evidence to support her conclusion. The money accusations came next, because apparently I was supposed to be both an unfaithful husband and a financial parasite. According to Sabrina's latest intel, I'd been funneling funds into side businesses and using Clara's connections for personal gain. This was rich coming from someone whose only job was professionally spending her sister's money. But hey, who's keeping track? She showed me bank statements. Marcus, transfers you've been making. Money going into accounts I don't recognize. This is where I almost laughed, because the mysterious transfers were me putting money into a savings account to surprise Clara with a trip to Italy for our anniversary. The unknown accounts were literally marked Anniversary Fund, Italy Trip in my banking app. But Sabrina had taken screenshots at just the right angle to make it look suspicious, like some kind of financial forensics expert who'd flunked out of detective school. Clara, those are savings for your anniversary present. I can log into my account right now and show you. Or, she said, and I could practically hear Sabrina whispering in her ear, you could have set that up as a cover story in case I found out. This is when I realized I was dealing with conspiracy theory levels of paranoia. No matter what evidence I provided, there was always another explanation that painted me as the bad guy. It was like playing chess with someone who changed the rules every time they were about to lose. The worst part wasn't even the accusations themselves. It was watching Clara transform into someone I didn't recognize. This woman who used to trust me completely, who would defend me against anyone and everyone, was now treating every word out of my mouth like it needed to be fact-checked by 3 independent sources. My friends tried to warn me. Dave from work took me out for drinks and said, "Dude, that sister-in-law of yours is straight up toxic. Clara's letting her pull the strings like she's a puppet." My buddy Mike was more direct. "Brother, you need to get ahead of this situation before it gets worse. That Sabrina chick has it out for you, and she's not going to stop until she gets what she wants." But I was stubborn. I thought love would win out over manipulation. I thought 3 years of marriage would count for more than a lifetime of sisterly bonds built on financial dependency and emotional manipulation. I thought Clara would eventually see through Sabrina's games and realize what was happening. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Thursday night. I remember because we were supposed to watch the season finale of that show Clara liked. The one about rich people with rich people problems that somehow made our actual rich people problems seem quaint by comparison. Instead, Clara was waiting for me in the living room with what looked like a full presentation prepared. I'm talking printed emails, highlighted bank statements, a timeline of my alleged infidelities that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. Sabrina's fingerprints were all over it, but Clara presented it like she'd uncovered it all herself. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," she said, her voice colder than a Manhattan winter. "Sabrina wouldn't lie to me about something this serious. She loves me. She's looking out for me. And everything she's told me, it all adds up." That's when I knew I'd lost. Not because of anything I'd done, but because Sabrina had played the long game perfectly. She'd convinced Clara that love meant suspicion, that trust was naive, and that the sister who'd been bleeding her dry financially was more reliable than the husband who'd been building a life with her. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. But sometimes when you're in the middle of the storm, you can't see the hurricane forming around you. The house that once felt like home had officially become enemy territory. You know that moment in movies where the protagonist gets the rug pulled out from under them, and there's always this dramatic music swelling in the background while they stand there looking shocked and betrayed? Well, real life doesn't come with a soundtrack. And let me tell you, getting kicked out of your own home is a lot less cinematic and a lot more soul-crushingly pathetic than Hollywood would have you believe. It was a Friday evening in October. I remember because the leaves in Central Park were just starting to turn, and I'd been thinking about how Clara and I used to take walks through there during our first autumn together. Funny how your brain focuses on the stupidest details when your world's about to implode. I'd just gotten home from work, loosening my tie and looking forward to a quiet weekend, maybe ordering from that Thai place Clara liked, watching something mindless on Netflix. You know, normal married couple stuff. Instead, I walked into what felt like a corporate boardroom meeting where I was both the defendant and the guy who didn't get the memo about what he was being accused of. Clara was standing in our living room. Excuse me, her living room, as I was about to be reminded, wearing that navy blue power suit that meant business. Not the fun kind of business, either. The kind of business that ends with someone getting fired, divorced, or in my case, both simultaneously. Her arms were crossed. Her expression was colder than a penguin's ass in Antarctica, and behind her, like some sort of designer-dressed demon whispering in her ear, stood Sabrina with a smirk that could have powered half of Manhattan. "We need to talk," Clara said, which was becoming her favorite phrase lately. It was like she'd trademarked those 4 words and decided to use them as a weapon of mass destruction against my peace of mind. "Okay," I said, setting down my briefcase and trying to read the room. The vibe was somewhere between funeral parlor and execution chamber, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be a conversation about weekend plans or whose turn it was to pick up the dry cleaning. Clara took a deep breath, the kind you take before you perform surgery or demolish a building. "Pack your things, Marcus. I can't trust you anymore." Just like that. No preamble, no lengthy explanation, no dramatic build-up. Just a sentence that hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo load of what the actual hell. I stood there for a moment, waiting for the punchline or the hidden camera crew or literally anything that would make this make sense. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed to say, because apparently my brain had decided to take a little vacation right when I needed it most. "You heard me," Clara said, and her voice had that flat, executive tone she used when she was firing underperforming employees. "I want you out of this house. Tonight. I can't have someone I don't trust living under my roof anymore." Under her roof. Not our roof. Her roof. Because apparently, 3 years of marriage had just been me crashing at Clara's place like some kind of overstayed house guest who'd finally worn out his welcome. Behind her, Sabrina was practically vibrating with satisfaction. She wasn't even trying to hide her glee anymore. The mask was off, the gloves were down, and she was basking in her victory like a cat who'd just caught the biggest, dumbest mouse in the history of pest control. "Clara, honey, let's talk about this," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, like I was negotiating a business deal instead of fighting for my marriage. "Whatever Sabrina told you. Don't." Clara held up her hand like a traffic cop stopping a speeding car. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on my sister. Sabrina didn't make you lie to me. Sabrina didn't make you sneak around behind my back. Sabrina didn't make you use me for my money and connections." It was like listening to a greatest hits album of all the garbage Sabrina had been feeding her for months. Suggestion
Every
that had been
accusation,
slowly killing our
every
marriage
twisted
was right
half-truth,
there in Clara's
every
voice,
poisonous.
delivered with the conviction of someone who'd completely bought into the con. "None of that is true, Clara, and you know it," I said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice despite my best efforts to stay cool. "I've never lied to you. I've never cheated on you, and I sure as hell have never used you for anything. I love you." Sabrina actually snorted at that. Literally snorted, like I'd just told the world's worst joke at the world's most inappropriate time. "Oh, please, Marcus. Save the performance for someone who's buying tickets. I'm not talking to you," I said, turning to look directly at her for the first time since this nightmare conversation started. "In fact, I'm pretty sure none of this is any of your damn business. It became my business the moment you started hurting my sister." Sabrina shot back, her voice dripping with fake righteous indignation. "Clara deserves better than someone who lies to her face every single day." That's when Clara stepped in, and the way she positioned herself, slightly in front of Sabrina, like she was protecting her from me. Told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay. Sabrina wouldn't lie to me about something this serious. Marcus. She loves me. She's looking out for me. And frankly, she's been right about you from the beginning. Right about me from the beginning. As in, Sabrina had been planning my downfall since day one, and Clara was just now admitting it out loud. As in, my wife had been listening to her sister poison our marriage for 3 years, and instead of defending our relationship, she'd been taking notes. So that's it? I asked, and I could feel something hardening inside my chest, like my heart was turning to stone in real time. 3 years of marriage, and you're just going to throw it all away because your unemployed, freeloading sister convinced you I'm some kind of criminal mastermind. The unemployed and freeloading comments hit their mark. Sabrina's face flushed red, and for a second, I saw a crack in her smug facade. But Clara stepped even further forward, her CEO instincts kicking in to protect her investment. Leave, Marcus. Now, before I call security. Security. She was threatening to call security on her own husband. In the home we'd shared for 3 years. The home where we'd laughed together, fought together, made love, made plans for the future, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and holidays. She was going to have me escorted out like some kind of trespasser who'd overstayed his welcome at a house party. I looked around the living room one last time. At the couch where we used to watch movies together, at the dining table where we'd hosted dinner parties, at the windows that looked out over the city we'd planned to grow old in together. All of it felt foreign now, like I was looking at someone else's life through a museum display case. Fine, I said, and my voice sounded strange and distant, even to me. I'll pack a bag. As I headed toward the bedroom. Excuse me, her bedroom, to grab some clothes and essentials. I could hear Sabrina whispering something to Clara, probably cementing her victory with some final poisonous observation about how this proved she'd been right all along. I threw some shirts, pants, underwear, and toiletries into a single duffel bag, moving on autopilot while my brain tried to process what had just happened. 3 years of my life, reduced to whatever I could fit in one bag during a 10-minute packing session while my wife's sister watched from the doorway, like a prison guard making sure I didn't steal the silver. When I walked back into the living room, Clara was standing by the door, holding it open like she couldn't wait to get me out of her sight. Sabrina was practically bouncing on her toes with excitement. This is a mistake, Clara, I said one last time. And someday you're going to realize it. The only mistake I made was trusting you in the first place. She replied, not even looking at me. So I walked out. I walked out of the penthouse, out of the building, out of the life I'd built with someone I thought loved me enough to at least give me the benefit of the doubt. The door closed behind me with a sound that felt like a coffin lid slamming shut. Standing on the sidewalk with my single bag, watching taxis and pedestrians go about their normal Friday evening routines, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Underneath all the hurt and anger and betrayal, there was this weird sense of relief. Like I'd finally stopped pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. They thought they'd won. They thought I'd come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and promising to be a better boy. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. You ever been to one of those fancy spas where they put you in a sensory deprivation tank and tell you it's supposed to be therapeutic? Well, let me tell you about the 3 weeks I spent in my crappy downtown apartment. Because it was basically the same experience, except instead of finding inner peace, I was plotting the most elegant revenge in the history of marital warfare. My new place was what real estate agents like to call cozy, and normal people call a shoebox with delusions of grandeur. 600 square feet of pure mediocrity, complete with a refrigerator that sounded like a dying whale, and neighbors who apparently thought practicing interpretive dance at 2 in the morning was a perfectly reasonable life choice. After 3 years of living in Clara's penthouse palace, this place felt like I'd been demoted from first class to the cargo hold of life. But you know what? It was mine. Nobody could kick me out of it. Nobody could stand in the living room and tell me to pack my things because they didn't trust me anymore. And most importantly, nobody could fill the air with poisonous whispers about what a terrible person I was while I was trying to watch Netflix and eat cereal for dinner like a functioning adult. The first few days were rough, I'll admit it. I spent a lot of time staring at the ceiling, wondering how the hell my life had taken such a hard left turn into Crazyville. I'd wake up in the morning and reach for Clara, only to remember that Clara was probably having champagne breakfast with her psychotic sister, celebrating their victory over the evil husband who'd apparently been running some kind of long-con marriage scam for 3 years. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It's actually pretty solid ground to build on. And while I was sitting there in my apartment, eating takeout Chinese food and wondering if this was what a midlife crisis looked like, something interesting started happening. My phone wasn't ringing. Not once. Not a single call from Clara asking how I was doing, or if I was okay, or if maybe we should talk about things like adults instead of letting her sister orchestrate my exile, like some kind of designer-dressed puppet master. Radio silence. Complete and total radio silence. Which told me everything I needed to know about how much my 3-year marriage had really meant to her. Apparently, throwing out your husband was like throwing out old furniture. Once it's gone, you don't really think about it anymore. But Sabrina? Oh, Sabrina was having the time of her life. Social media became her personal victory lap, and I got to watch the whole show from my front row seat in Loserville. Instagram stories featuring expensive lunches with captions like, "So grateful for family, who really have your back." Facebook posts about toxic people and how sometimes you have to cut dead weight to truly flourish. Twitter updates about supporting strong women who deserve better. Each post was like a little digital middle finger aimed directly at me. And the worst part? She was doing it all from Clara's accounts, Clara's events, Clara's money. The unemployed sister who'd never worked a day in her life was playing social media influencer with someone else's success. And somehow, I was the villain in this story. But instead of getting pissed off, which is what the old Marcus would have done, I started getting curious. Because here's what didn't add up. If I was such a terrible husband, such a lying, cheating, money-grabbing scumbag, why wasn't Clara talking about it? Why wasn't she posting her own free at last celebration posts? Why was Sabrina doing all the public victory dancing while Clara stayed conspicuously quiet? That's when I started paying attention to the details. And brother, when you're a project manager who spent 20 years of his career catching other people's mistakes and fixing other people's messes, you develop a pretty good eye for things that don't quite line up. Like the fact that Clara's company had been unusually quiet lately. No big announcements, no new developments, no press releases about record-breaking sales quarters. For a woman who usually treated her business success like a full-contact sport, the silence was deafening. Like the fact that Sabrina's social media posts, while frequent and obnoxious, were all taking place at the same handful of locations. The penthouse, that overpriced cafe Clara liked, the same 3 or 4 restaurants. For someone who was supposedly living her best life, she wasn't getting around much. Like the fact that none of Clara's business associates or friends had reached out to me. Not to offer condolences, not to ask what happened, not even to be nosy about the divorce rumors that were probably circulating through their social circles like wildfire. In a community where gossip traveled faster than bad stock tips, the complete silence was weird. So I started doing what I do best, research. Not the creepy stalker kind of research. I'm not a psychopath. But the methodical, professional kind of research that comes from years of managing complex projects where one missed detail can cost everyone involved a fortune. I started with the easy stuff. Public records, business filings, anything that was legally available to anyone who bothered to look. And that's when things started getting interesting. Turns out, Whitmore Luxury Real Estate had been having what you might call a challenging fiscal quarter. Several deals had fallen through. A couple of major investors had pulled out, and there were some regulatory issues with a development project that had been Clara's pet project for the past 2 years. Nothing catastrophic, but definitely not the kind of smooth sailing Clara was used to. Then I started looking into the prenup. You remember the prenup, right? The one Clara had insisted on back when we were so in love that she wanted to make sure I was protected if anything ever happened to her business empire? The one she drafted when she was still thinking with her heart instead of listening to her sister's paranoid fantasies? Here's something most people don't know about prenups. They're not just about protecting the wealthy spouse from the poor spouse. Sometimes, depending on how they're written and when they're signed, they can work the other way around. Especially when the wealthy spouse initiates a divorce based on false accusations and refuses to attempt counseling or mediation. I spent hours reading through that document. And let me tell you, 3 years ago, Clara had been a very different person from current Clara. 3 years ago, Clara had been madly in love and wanted to make sure I felt secure in our marriage. She'd insisted on clauses that would protect me if she ever became abusive, controlling, or unfaithful. She'd included provisions for substantial alimony if the marriage ended due to her misconduct or unreasonable behavior. Unreasonable behavior. Like, say, throwing your husband out of the house based on lies told by your freeloading sister, without any evidence of actual wrongdoing, and refusing to even attempt to work through your problems like adults. Current Clara probably didn't even remember those clauses. She'd been so focused on protecting her assets from a hypothetical bad husband that she'd accidentally created a legal safety net for the good husband she was about to throw away. While I was discovering this interesting legal tidbit, I also started documenting everything. Screenshots of Sabrina's social media posts, particularly the ones that could be interpreted as harassment or defamation. Records of all my attempts to contact Clara and work things out. Evidence of my actual whereabouts during the times Sabrina claimed I was having affairs or conducting mysterious business meetings. And slowly, quietly, methodically, I started building a case that would have made my old law school professors proud. Not because I was planning to destroy anyone. I'm not a vindictive person by nature. But because I was finally done being the victim in someone else's twisted family drama. The phone call from Clara came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after she'd kicked me out. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee, and reading through some particularly interesting financial documents I'd requested from our accountant, when my phone buzzed with her name. For a split second, I thought about not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. Marcus. Her voice sounded different. Smaller. Less certain. We need to talk. Have you had time to reflect? Reflect. Like I was a naughty child who'd been sent to his room to think about what he'd done wrong. Sure, Clara, I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. I've had plenty of time to reflect. Good. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Say 2 o'clock? I think we should discuss how to move forward. Move forward. Translation. She wanted to see if I was ready to come crawling back, apologize for crimes I didn't commit, and probably sign some kind of agreement that would let her file for divorce while maintaining the moral high ground. I'll be there, I said. And I would be. But not for the reasons she thought. Time to show Clara and her manipulative sister exactly what 3 weeks of reflection had produced. You know that feeling when you're playing poker and you've got a royal flush, but you have to sit there with a straight face while everyone else at the table thinks they're about to clean you out? That's exactly how I felt sitting in my crappy apartment the morning after Clara's phone call, sipping coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through gym socks while mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. Clara wanted to meet at her office. Of course she did. Because why have a personal conversation about the implosion of your marriage in a neutral location when you can do it in the executive boardroom where you hold all the power? It was a classic Clara move. Control the environment, control the narrative, control the outcome. She probably had her whole speech prepared, maybe even had her assistant schedule it between her 10 o'clock with the Peterson account and her 3:30 with the city planning committee. Have you had time to reflect? She'd asked, like I was some kind of wayward employee who'd been suspended pending a performance review. The arrogance of that question was honestly breathtaking. Here was a woman who'd thrown her husband out of their home based on the word of her professional mooch of a sister, and she was asking me if I'd learned my lesson yet. Oh, I'd reflected, all right. I'd reflected so hard I was practically a goddamn philosopher at this point. I spent the morning getting ready like I was preparing for war, which, in a way, I was. Shower, shave, the whole 9 yards. I put on my best suit, the charcoal gray one Clara had bought me for her company's annual gala last year, back when she was still proud to have me as arm candy at her business functions. Ironic, really. I was about to use her own gift to look professional while I systematically dismantled the assumptions that had led to this moment. The briefcase was the key prop in today's little drama. Black leather, expensive looking, the kind of thing that screams serious business in any corporate setting. Clara had given it to me for our 2nd anniversary, back when she thought having a project manager husband was charming instead of embarrassing. Inside, I'd carefully arranged all my research from the past 3 weeks. Copies of the prenup with the relevant sections highlighted, financial records, bank statements, screenshots of Sabrina's social media posts, documentation of my actual whereabouts during the times I was supposedly cheating. But the real beauty of my preparation wasn't what I'd included, it was what I'd left out. Because sometimes the most effective strategy isn't showing all your cards at once. Sometimes it's about letting your opponents think they know what you're holding while you keep the royal flush hidden until the perfect moment. I got to Clara's office building about 20 minutes early, because punctuality was one of those middle-class habits I'd never been able to shake, even after years of living in the penthouse. The lobby was all marble and glass and the kind of aggressive minimalism that screams, "We charge $500 an hour, and we're worth every penny." The security guard nodded at me like he recognized me, which he probably did from all the times I'd come here to surprise Clara with lunch or flowers, or just to be a supportive husband during her particularly stressful weeks. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. I took the elevator to the 15th floor, listening to the kind of generic jazz that's designed to make you feel sophisticated while you wait to get screwed over by people in expensive suits. The receptionist, Jessica, I think her name was, smiled at me with that professional warmth that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Mr. Hale, it's been a while. Mrs. Whitmore is expecting you. Conference room A. Conference room A. The big one. The one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The one where Clara held her most important meetings with investors and city officials. She wasn't just meeting with me. She was making a statement. This was business now, not personal. I was being summoned to the principal's office to discuss my behavioral issues. I sat in the waiting area, watching Clara's employees go about their daily routines. These were people I'd met at company parties, people who'd congratulated me when Clara and I got married, people who'd probably been gossiping about my mysterious disappearance for the past 3 weeks. I wondered how many of them knew the real story versus Sabrina's version of events. I wondered how many of them actually cared. The thing about corporate environments is that they have this way of making everything feel important and official, even when it's just personal drama dressed up in business attire. But that formality works both ways. If Clara wanted to treat this like a business meeting, then I was going to give her the full professional experience. My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. "Documents ready when you are. Give them hell." Documents. Plural. Because while Clara had been spending the past 3 weeks basking in her victory over the terrible husband, I'd been doing something she apparently hadn't considered. I'd been getting legal advice from someone who actually knew what they were talking about. At exactly 2 o'clock, Jessica appeared at my side with that same professional smile. "Mrs. Whitmore is ready for you now." I followed her down the hallway, past the motivational posters and awards and photographs of Clara shaking hands with various important-looking people. This was her domain, her kingdom, her carefully constructed monument to success and control. And in about 10 minutes, I was going to show her exactly how much control she actually had over this situation. The conference room door opened, and there she was. Clara, sitting at the head of the long mahogany table like she was chairing a board meeting instead of having a conversation with her estranged husband. She looked good. She always looked good, but there was something different about her face. Tired, maybe, or stressed. The past 3 weeks hadn't been as easy as she'd pretended. And there, sitting to her right like some kind of evil advisor, was Sabrina. Because of course Sabrina was there. Of course the woman who'd orchestrated this entire situation would want to be present for my humiliation. She was probably planning to live tweet the whole thing. "Marcus," Clara said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please sit down." I sat down and placed my briefcase on the table with deliberate care. Both women looked at it with curiosity, probably wondering what pathetic collection of apologies and promises I'd brought to grovel my way back into their good graces. "Thank you for coming," Clara continued, slipping into her CEO voice like putting on a familiar jacket. "I hope these past few weeks have given you time to think about everything that's happened between us. Everything that's happened between us. Like our marriage had just spontaneously combusted instead of being systematically destroyed by the woman sitting next to her." "Oh, I've been thinking," I said, keeping my voice calm and pleasant. "I've been thinking a lot." Sabrina leaned forward slightly, that familiar smirk playing around the corners of her mouth. She was enjoying this already, anticipating the moment when I'd break down and beg for forgiveness, while she got to play the role of the protective sister who'd saved Clara from a terrible mistake. "Good," Clara said, "because I think we need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation going forward. Our marriage, our living arrangements, our future. Our future." The way she said it, with that slight pause, told me everything I needed to know about what kind of future she had in mind. There would be a divorce, probably with me taking the blame for the whole mess. There would be a settlement, probably heavily weighted in her favor. There would be a narrative where she was the successful businesswoman who'd been taken advantage of by a gold-digging husband, and Sabrina was the loyal sister who'd tried to warn her. It was a nice plan. Clean, simple, effective. Too bad for them that I'd spent the past 3 weeks coming up with a better one. Actually, Clara, I said, reaching for my briefcase, I think you're right. We do need to discuss our future. And I've brought along some materials that I think will help clarify exactly what that future is going to look like. The briefcase clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Both women were staring at me now with expressions that had shifted from confident control to something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. Before we get started, I continued, pulling out a neat stack of papers. I just want to say that I've done a lot of reflecting over the past 3 weeks. About our marriage, about trust, about what happens when people make assumptions without checking the facts first. I placed the papers on the table between us and looked directly at Clara for the first time since I'd walked into the room. And what I've concluded is that you're absolutely right. We do need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation going forward. I slid the papers across the table to her with a smile that probably looked a lot more confident than I felt. Starting with these divorce papers, I'd like you to sign. You know that moment in chess when you move your queen into position and your opponent suddenly realizes they've been playing checkers this whole time? That's exactly what Clara's face looked like when those divorce papers hit the mahogany table with all the subtle impact of a nuclear bomb wrapped in legal letterhead. The silence in that conference room was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it as an appetizer at one of Clara's fancy business dinners. Both women were staring at the documents like I'd just pulled a live snake out of my briefcase instead of a perfectly legitimate legal filing that had been prepared by one of the best divorce attorneys in the city. Clara's hand was hovering over the papers like she was afraid they might burst into flames if she actually touched them. Her perfectly composed CEO mask was starting to crack around the edges, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out how the hell the meeting had gotten away from her this quickly. Sabrina, on the other hand, looked like someone had just told her Christmas was canceled and her trust fund had been donated to charity. The smirk that had been permanently attached to her face for the past 3 weeks had vanished completely, replaced by an expression that was somewhere between confusion and pure, unadulterated panic. What is this? Clara finally managed to say, her voice carrying just the tiniest tremor that told me I'd succeeded in rattling her cage in a way that probably hadn't happened since her first board meeting 20 years ago. Those are divorce papers, I said helpfully, like I was explaining basic math to a particularly slow kindergartner. You know, the legal documents that officially end a marriage when one party decides to throw the other party out of their shared home based on completely fabricated accusations. I kept my voice pleasant and conversational, the same tone I'd used to discuss the weather or ask someone to pass the salt. Professional courtesy, you might call it. After all, we were in a business setting, and I believed in maintaining appropriate workplace decorum even when I was systematically destroying someone's assumptions about how this conversation was going to go. Clara picked up the papers with hands that were definitely not as steady as they'd been 5 minutes ago. Her eyes started scanning the first page, and I watched her face go through a fascinating series of expressions as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock gave way to disbelief. And disbelief was rapidly approaching something that looked suspiciously like the early stages of pure terror. "Marcus," she said slowly, like she was trying to talk a jumpy horse into not throwing her off a cliff. "Surely we can discuss this like adults. There's no need for lawyers and legal proceedings. We can work something out privately." Privately. Translation: she wanted to negotiate this mess behind closed doors where she could control the narrative and minimize the damage to her reputation. Where she could spin it as a mutual decision instead of the train wreck it actually was. "Oh, we absolutely can discuss this like adults," I agreed cheerfully. "In fact, that's exactly what we're doing right now. You're an adult, I'm an adult, and these are adult consequences for adult decisions." Funny how that works, isn't it? Sabrina had been unusually quiet during this exchange, which should have been my first warning that she was about to do something spectacularly stupid. But I was so focused on watching Clara's world crumble in real time that I didn't notice the storm brewing in the cheap seats until it was too late. You can't do this. Sabrina suddenly exploded, slamming her manicured hand down on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. You can't just waltz in here and destroy my sister's life because you got caught red-handed. And there it was. The mask was completely off now, and Sabrina was showing her true colors in all their ugly, manipulative glory. Gone was the concerned sister act, the subtle poison whispered in Clara's ear. This was pure, undiluted rage from someone who'd just realized that her carefully constructed house of lies was about to come tumbling down around her ears. Caught red-handed doing what, exactly? I asked, turning to look at her directly for the first time since this whole circus had started. Please, enlighten me. What exactly was I caught doing? You know what you did? She shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that probably had dogs howling 3 blocks away. The affairs, the money, the lies. Which affairs? I interrupted calmly. The ones where I was supposedly seen at Cafe Milano when I was actually in a conference room with witnesses who can verify my whereabouts? Or maybe you're talking about the mysterious blonde woman who turned out to be a barista at Starbucks who can't spell my name correctly on a coffee cup. Sabrina's face was turning an interesting shade of red that clashed horribly with her designer outfit. The money transfers. The secret accounts. You mean my anniversary savings account? I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app with theatrical precision. The one labeled Anniversary Fund, Italy trip that I was using to surprise Clara with a romantic vacation? Would you like to see the screenshots? Or should I just email them directly to Clara's legal team? This was the beautiful thing about dealing with pathological liars. They never expect you to have actual facts to back up your side of the story. They get so used to operating in a world of whispered suggestions and manufactured drama that they forget normal people keep records of things like bank statements and work schedules. Clara was still reading through the divorce papers, and I could tell she'd gotten to the really interesting parts because her face had gone from pale to absolutely ghostly. She was looking at the prenup clauses, the ones that spelled out in excruciating legal detail exactly what happened when a marriage ended due to unreasonable behavior on the part of the wealthy spouse. Unreasonable behavior. Like refusing to investigate accusations before acting on them. Like throwing your spouse out of the marital home without cause. Like prioritizing the word of a financially dependent family member over the person you'd promised to love, honor, and trust until death do you part. Marcus, Clara said quietly, and for the first time in months, she sounded like the woman I'd married instead of the CO who'd been interrogating me over dinner for weeks. These clauses, I don't remember agreeing to these terms. You insisted on them, I reminded her gently. You said you wanted me to feel secure in our marriage. You said you never wanted me to worry that you might use your wealth as a weapon against me if things got difficult. The irony was so thick you could have used it to pave roads. Clara had been so concerned about protecting me from hypothetical future Clara that she'd accidentally created a legal safety net for exactly this situation. Sabrina was reading over Clara's shoulder now, and I watched her face go from red to white to an interesting shade of green as she realized what those highlighted sections actually meant. Her sister, her meal ticket, her source of income, her entire lifestyle, was about to become significantly less wealthy, and it was all because of the lies Sabrina herself had planted. Clara, you can't sign this, Sabrina whispered urgently. There has to be another way. You can fight it. You can. Fight what? Clara asked, and her voice sounded hollow and defeated. Fight the prenup I insisted on. Fight the documented evidence that Marcus wasn't actually cheating. Fight the fact that I threw my husband out of our home based on accusations I never bothered to verify. She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the woman I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. The one who was brilliant and successful, but also vulnerable and uncertain beneath all that corporate armor. How much? She asked quietly. I pretended to think about it for a moment, even though I'd memorized every single clause and calculation weeks ago. According to the prenup you drafted, and given the circumstances of our separation, the monthly alimony comes out to roughly 30% of your net income for the next 5 years, with a lump sum payment of $2.4 million to be paid within 60 days of the divorce decree. Sabrina made a sound like she was choking on her own tongue. $2.4 million? Clara, you can't afford that. The business, the expenses, the gambling debts. I suggested helpfully. Oh yes, we'll definitely need to discuss those. Both women went very, very still. Even the air in the room seemed to stop moving, like the entire building was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Gambling debts, Clara repeated slowly. And that's when I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. Time for the real fun to begin. You ever watch a controlled demolition on TV? You know, where they blow up an old building and it comes down in slow motion, floor by floor, until there's nothing left but dust and debris? That's exactly what happened to Sabrina Whitmore's composure when I dropped the words gambling debts into that conference room like a stick of dynamite with a very short fuse. The transformation was honestly spectacular. 1 second she was sitting there trying to look like the concerned sister, still clinging to the last shreds of her victim act. And the next second, she was launching herself out of her chair like someone had just electrified the upholstery. "You bastard," she screamed, and I mean screamed, the kind of sound that probably sent every dog in a 5-block radius running for cover. "You lying, manipulative bastard. You can't prove anything." But there's the beautiful thing about gambling addicts, especially the kind who think they're smarter than everyone else. They leave a trail of evidence longer than the receipt from a Black Friday shopping spree at Macy's. And when that evidence involves stealing money from your sister's business accounts to feed your addiction, well, that trail becomes less like breadcrumbs and more like neon highway markers pointing straight to federal prison. Clara was staring at Sabrina like she'd never seen her before in her life. Gambling debts? Sabrina, what is he talking about? Nothing. Sabrina shot back, but her voice had gone up about 3 octaves, which is generally not what innocent people sound like when they're denying accusations. He's making it up. He's trying to deflect from his own crimes by my own crimes. I interrupted, reaching back into my magical briefcase of truth bombs. You mean like this? I pulled out a manila folder that was thick enough to choke a horse and placed it gently on the table between us. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents overhead. "These are bank statements," I said conversationally, like I was discussing the weather instead of about to destroy someone's entire life. "Not mine, obviously, since you've already established that my finances are an open book. These are from several offshore accounts that were opened using Clara's business credit and social security number." Clara's face went from pale to absolutely ghostly. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" "Well, it's interesting," I continued, opening the folder and spreading out the documents with the kind of care usually reserved for handling ancient manuscripts. "It seems someone has been making regular transfers from Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's operating accounts into these offshore holdings for the past 18 months. Small amounts at first, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, but gradually increasing in frequency and size." Sabrina was standing now, backing away from the table like the papers were radioactive. "You can't, that's not. How did you? How did I get these?" I smiled at her with all the warmth of a shark who'd just spotted a wounded seal. Funny thing about being married to a CEO, you pick up a few contacts in the financial investigation business. Turns out, when you pay the right people enough money, they can trace just about any financial irregularity back to its source. I pulled out another sheet. This one with highlighted sections that looked like a Christmas tree had exploded all over it. This particular account shows regular withdrawals at various casinos in Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and, my personal favorite, an online poker site called Lucky Lady's Last Chance. Really classy name, by the way. Very subtle. Clara was reading over my shoulder now, her breathing getting shallow and quick like someone was slowly squeezing all the air out of the room. "Sabrina, please tell me this isn't what it looks like." "It's not what it looks like," Sabrina shrieked, but she was still backing toward the door like she was planning to make a run for it. "He's fabricated all of this. He's trying to frame me because he knows he's caught." That's when I pulled out my phone and opened up the photo gallery with the kind of theatrical flourish that would have made Shakespeare proud. "You know, Sabrina, for someone who's supposedly being framed, you sure do take a lot of selfies at casino tables." The photos were beautiful, really. Crystal clear shots of Sabrina living her best life at blackjack tables, slot machines, and poker games, all tagged with locations and timestamps that corresponded perfectly with the dates of the mysterious account withdrawals. Social media had been her downfall, She'd been so proud of her high-roller lifestyle that she'd documented every single gambling session like she was creating evidence for her own prosecution. "These are from your Instagram account," I explained helpfully to Clara, who was staring at the photos like they were pictures of her sister committing murder. Apparently, Sabrina thought her gambling adventures were worth sharing with the world. Very civic-minded of her, really. Made my investigator's job much easier. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "You stole from my company? You stole from me. I didn't steal anything." Sabrina was full-on hyperventilating now, her designer dress sticking to her, with sweat despite the air conditioning that was probably set to Arctic. "It was just borrowing. I was going to pay it back. I was on a winning streak, and—" "A winning streak." I laughed, and I'll admit it wasn't a particularly nice laugh. "According to these records, you've lost approximately $473,000 over the past 18 months. If that's a winning streak, I'd hate to see what you consider a losing streak." The number hit Clara like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward and had to grab the edge of the conference table to keep herself upright. $473,000? Sabrina, that's almost half our emergency operating fund. It would have been more, I added cheerfully, but the accounts got flagged by the fraud prevention system last month. Turns out banks get suspicious when someone suddenly starts making large transfers to offshore gambling sites. Who knew? That's when Sabrina completely lost what was left of her mind. She started screaming. Not words, just pure, inarticulate rage, and before anyone could react, she grabbed the water pitcher from the conference table and hurled it at me with the kind of accuracy that suggested she'd been practicing. I ducked. The pitcher shattered against the wall behind me in a very satisfying explosion of glass and water, and suddenly the conference room looked like a hurricane had blown through it. "You destroyed everything," she screamed, advancing on me with her hands curved into claws like she was planning to scratch my eyes out. "Everything I worked for, everything I built, everything you built." Clara's voice cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "You built nothing, Sabrina. You've never worked a day in your life. You've been living off my money, stealing from my company, and apparently lying to me about everything for years." The sisters were facing each other now across the wreckage of the conference room, and the family resemblance had never been clearer. They had the same bone structure, the same general build, but Clara looked like strength and determination, while Sabrina looked like those qualities had been twisted into something desperate and ugly. "I protected you from him," Sabrina shrieked, pointing at me like I was the devil himself. "He was using you. He was going to take everything you worked for. The only person who's been taking everything I worked for is you." Clara shot back, and her voice had that cutting edge that made her opponents in business negotiations break out in cold sweats. "You've been robbing me blind while telling me my husband was the criminal." I decided this was probably a good time to interject before someone ended up needing medical attention. "Clara, I think we should call security. And probably the police. Embezzlement is a felony, and assault with a water pitcher is at least a misdemeanor." The word police seemed to snap Sabrina back to something resembling reality. She stopped advancing on me and started looking around the room like she was just now realizing how completely screwed she was. "Clara, please," she said, and suddenly her voice was small and desperate instead of angry. "I'm your sister. Family. We can work this out. I can get help. I can go to therapy, join Gamblers Anonymous, whatever you want. Just don't." "Don't what?" Clara interrupted. "Don't hold you accountable for stealing from me? Don't expect you to face consequences for destroying my marriage? Don't demand answers for why you've been systematically lying to me for months?" The fight went out of Sabrina all at once, like someone had pulled her plug. She collapsed back into her chair and started crying. Not the pretty, delicate tears of a movie heroine, but the ugly, snotty, mascara-running kind of crying that people do when their entire world falls apart in the span of 10 minutes. Clara looked at her sister for a long moment, then turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. A very big apology. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Actually, Clara," I said, gathering up my papers with deliberate care, "I think what you owe me is a signature on those divorce papers." The real reckoning was just getting started. You know what they say about truth being stranger than fiction? Well, let me tell you, after spending 3 weeks digging into Sabrina Whitmore's financial activities, I was starting to think whoever came up with that saying had clearly never met someone whose entire life was built on a foundation of lies, theft, and what I can only describe as weaponized incompetence. But here's the thing about people like Sabrina. They never commit just one crime. They're like potato chips of criminal behavior. You can't steal just once. And while I was watching her have her dramatic meltdown in Clara's conference room, I realized I hadn't even gotten to the really juicy stuff yet. My lawyer had outdone himself. The man was like a financial archaeologist, digging through layers of deception to uncover artifacts of fraud that would have impressed the FBI's white-collar crime division. While Sabrina was still blubbering in her chair and Clara was staring at her sister like she'd never seen her before, I reached back into my briefcase one more time. Actually, I said, pulling out yet another folder that was even thicker than the first one. The gambling addiction is just the tip of the iceberg. Clara looked at me with eyes that were already so wide they were in danger of falling out of her head. There's more. Oh, honey, there's so much more. I opened the new folder with the kind of reverence usually reserved for handling nuclear material. See, when you hire a really good financial investigator, and I mean really good, the kind who charges more per day than most people make in a month, they don't just look at the obvious stuff. They dig deeper. They follow paper trails that most people don't even know exist. Sabrina had stopped crying and was now staring at me with the kind of horror usually reserved for people who've just realized they're in a horror movie and they're definitely not the final girl. What I discovered, I continued, spreading out documents like I was laying down a winning hand in the world's most expensive poker game, is that our dear Sabrina here has been running what you might call a diversified portfolio of fraud. The first document was a credit report that looked like it had been through a paper shredder and reassembled by someone having a nervous breakdown. Credit cards opened in Clara's name. 17 of them, to be exact, with a combined limit of just over $600,000. Clara's face went through a fascinating series of expressions, like she was cycling through every stage of grief simultaneously. Credit cards? In my name? All maxed out, naturally, I said cheerfully. The monthly payments have been automatically deducted from Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's accounts for the past 2 years. Your accounting department probably thought they were legitimate business expenses. I pulled out another sheet, this one covered in so many colored highlights it looked like a rainbow had exploded on it. Then there are the loans. Personal loans, business loans, something called a luxury lifestyle advance from a company that I'm pretty sure is just 3 guys in a basement somewhere who charge interest rates that would make loan sharks blush. Sabrina was making small whimpering sounds now, like a dog that knows it's about to get taken to the vet for something unpleasant. Clara, on the other hand, was getting that focused look she got when she was about to destroy someone in a business negotiation. How much? Clara asked, and her voice had gone completely flat and emotionless, which anyone who knew her would recognize as a very, very bad sign. I pretended to consult my notes, even though I had these numbers memorized down to the penny. Well, if we include the gambling losses, the credit card debt, the various loans, and the compound interest on everything, we're looking at approximately $1.2 million in total debt that's been systematically transferred onto your personal and business credit. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the elevator dinging in the hallway outside. Clara was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language, and Sabrina looked like she was seriously considering whether jumping out the 15th floor window would be preferable to whatever was about to happen next. But wait, there was more. Because when you're dealing with someone who's spent years perfecting the art of financial parasitism, you don't stop at simple theft. You branch out into more creative endeavors. Oh, and then there's the real estate, I said, pulling out what looked like a stack of property deeds and mortgage documents. Turns out Sabrina has been quite the entrepreneur in the property investment business. Clara's head snapped up. What property? 3 condos in Miami, a beach house in the Hamptons, and, this is my personal favorite, a timeshare in Aspen that apparently comes with its own private ski instructor. I spread out the paperwork with the kind of care usually reserved for handling evidence at a crime scene. All purchased using loans that were secured against Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's assets. That's impossible, Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction. I would have had to sign off on any loans using company assets as collateral. I pulled out a magnifying glass. Yes, I actually brought a magnifying glass, because sometimes you have to lean into the drama, and handed it to her along with one of the documents. Take a look at the signature line. Clara examined the signature under magnification, and I watched her face go from confusion to understanding to pure, undiluted rage in the span of about 10 seconds. "This is my signature," she said quietly. "Technically, yes," I agreed. "But unless you've developed a sudden interest in timeshares and beach houses that you forgot to mention, I'm guessing you didn't actually sign these documents." Forgery. We'd officially moved from simple theft into federal crime territory, and judging by the look on Sabrina's face, she was starting to realize that her problems had just escalated from awkward family dinner conversation to potentially spending the next decade in an orange jumpsuit. "Sabrina," Clara said, and her voice was so cold it could have frozen nitrogen. "Did you forge my signature?" "I can explain." Sabrina burst out, finally finding her voice now that she was staring down the barrel of serious jail time. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent. I was going to pay everything back. The timeshare was an investment. The condos were appreciating in value. It was all going to work out. You forged my signature to steal over $1 million, Clara said slowly, like she was testing each word to make sure it was real. You destroyed my marriage with lies while you were robbing me blind. You've been living off my money, sleeping in a bed I paid for, eating food I bought, while systematically destroying everything I've worked for. The breakdown of their relationship was happening in real time, and it was honestly beautiful to watch. 28 years of sisterly bonds, built on trust and family loyalty and shared childhood memories, crumbling under the weight of documented evidence that Sabrina had been treating Clara like her personal ATM for years. "Clara, I'm your sister," Sabrina wailed, playing her last card with all the desperation of someone who's just realized they're holding a losing hand. "Family. Blood. That has to count for something." "You're right," Clara said, standing up slowly and walking over to where Sabrina was cowering in her chair. "It does count for something. It makes what you've done so much worse." She picked up her phone and started dialing. "Who are you calling?" Sabrina asked, though I think we all knew the answer. "The police," Clara said calmly. "And then my lawyer. And then my accountant. And then probably the FBI, because I'm pretty sure what you've done crosses state lines, which makes it a federal crime." Sabrina started crying again, but this time it wasn't the angry, frustrated crying from before. This was the kind of desperate, hopeless crying that people do when they realize their entire life has just imploded and there's no way to put the pieces back together. Clara looked at me across the wreckage of the conference room, across the destroyed remains of our marriage and her relationship with her sister, and for the first time in months, I saw something in her eyes that looked like respect. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I waited. "Is there any chance at all, that we could find a way to fix this?" And that's when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. You know that moment in every revenge movie where the hero has the villain exactly where they want them, and you're sitting there waiting to see if they're going to show mercy or deliver the killing blow. Well, let me tell you something about real life. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone isn't destruction. Sometimes it's just walking away and letting them live with the consequences of their own choices. Clara was looking at me with those big, desperate eyes that had once made me melt like butter on hot toast. The same eyes that had convinced me to propose, that had made me believe I was the luckiest guy in the world when she said yes, that had looked at me with such love and trust during our wedding ceremony that I'd actually teared up in front of 300 of Manhattan's most influential people. Now those same eyes were pleading with me to save her from the wreckage of her own making. "Is there any chance we could fix this?" she'd asked, and the hope in her voice was so fragile it was practically heartbreaking. Almost. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers with the same methodical care I'd used throughout this entire spectacular shit show. Every document went back into its proper folder. Every folder went back into the briefcase. Every piece of evidence that had just demolished her world packed away neat and tidy like I was cleaning up after a particularly successful business presentation. "Fix this," I repeated, testing the words like I was trying to figure out what language she was speaking. "Clara, honey, I'm not sure you understand what this actually is anymore." Behind her, Sabrina had finally managed to stop crying long enough to pay attention to our conversation, and I could see the desperate calculation in her eyes. She was probably thinking that if Clara and I got back together, maybe she could somehow wiggle out of the legal nightmare she'd created for herself. Maybe Big Sister would protect her one more time, cover for her crimes, find a way to make all the bad stuff disappear like it always had before. Too bad for Sabrina that those days were officially over. "I know I made mistakes," Clara said, and credit where credit's due. She was trying to maintain some dignity even though her entire world was collapsing around her ears. "I know I trusted the wrong person. I know I should have believed you instead of." She gestured vaguely at her sister, who was still huddled in her chair like a designer-dressed gargoyle. "Instead of me. I finished for her. Instead of your husband. Instead of the man you promised to love, honor, and trust until death do us part. Instead of the guy who spent 3 years of his life building a relationship with you while your sister was systematically robbing you blind and poisoning your mind against me." Each word hit her like a physical blow, and I could see her flinch with every accusation. But here's the thing about consequences. They don't care about your feelings. They don't care how sorry you are or how much you regret your choices. They just exist, heavy and permanent and utterly unforgiving. "Marcus, please," she said, and there was real pain in her voice now. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. But we can start over. We can rebuild. I'll make it right. Start over." Like the past 3 months had been some kind of minor disagreement, instead of a complete character assassination orchestrated by the person she'd chosen to trust over me. Like I could just forget the night she'd thrown me out of our home like garbage, the weeks of silence, the absolute certainty in her voice when she told me that Sabrina wouldn't lie to her about something so important. "How exactly are you planning to make it right, Clara?" I asked, closing the briefcase with a satisfying click that seemed to echo through the destroyed conference room. "Are you going to give me back the 3 years I spent married to someone who was willing to believe the worst about me without a shred of evidence? Are you going to undo the humiliation of being kicked out of my own home? Are you going to somehow erase the fact that when push came to shove, you chose your lying, stealing, manipulative sister over the husband who'd never given you any reason not to trust him?" The questions hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and I could see Clara scrambling for answers that didn't exist. Because that's the thing about trust. Once it's broken, really truly broken, all the apologies in the world can't put it back together again. You can say you're sorry, you can promise to do better, you can even mean it with every fiber of your being. But you can't unknow what you learned about someone's character when they showed you who they really were in a crisis. And Clara had shown me exactly who she was when things got difficult. She was someone who would throw away 3 years of marriage based on the word of a person who'd been lying to her about everything else in her life. That wasn't the kind of person I wanted to be married to anymore. "I love you," she said desperately, playing her last card with all the finesse of someone who'd just realized the deck was stacked against them. "I know I screwed up, but I love you, Marcus. That has to count for something." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been the center of my universe for 3 years, this brilliant, successful, powerful CEO who could negotiate million-dollar deals in her sleep, but couldn't see through her own sister's pathetically obvious lies. And I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no residual love trying to pull me back into the disaster she'd created. Just a vast, empty sense of being done with all of it. "You know what, Clara? I actually believe that you think you love me. But here's what I've learned about your version of love. It's conditional. It depends on other people's opinions. It evaporates the moment someone whispers something ugly in your ear. That's not love, sweetheart. That's just convenience with feelings attached." Sabrina tried to interject, probably hoping to salvage something from this train wreck, but I held up a hand that stopped her cold. "And you," I said, turning to look at her directly. "You don't get to say a goddamn word. You've done enough talking for one lifetime. Security will be here soon to escort you out, and then you get to spend the next few years explaining to various law enforcement agencies exactly how you thought stealing over $1 million from your sister was a reasonable life choice." I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the door, leaving both women sitting in the wreckage of their relationship and Clara's business empire. But just before I reached the exit, Clara called out one last time. "Marcus, please, don't leave like this. I was wrong about everything, but we can fix it. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. I'll do anything." I stopped with my hand on the door handle, and turned back to look at her one final time. She was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks, and probably cost more than most people's monthly salary in ruined makeup. And for just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You want to know the really sad part about all of this, Clara? I said quietly. If you had just asked me about any of those accusations, if you had just given me the chance to defend myself instead of deciding I was guilty based on your sister's word, none of this would have happened. Your marriage would be intact, your business would be secure, and Sabrina would still be your problem to deal with instead of the FBI's. I opened the door, and the sounds of normal office life drifted in from the hallway, phones ringing, people having ordinary conversations about ordinary problems, the blessed mundane reality of a world where people weren't destroying each other's lives over fabricated betrayals. But you chose to trust her instead of me, I continued. You chose to believe the worst about the person who'd never given you any reason to doubt him. And now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. I walked out of that conference room, out of Clara's office building, out of the life I'd built with someone who'd turned out to be a stranger wearing the face of the woman I'd loved. Behind me, I could hear Sabrina starting to wail again and Clara trying to calm her down, but their voices faded as I made my way to the elevator. The doors closed with a soft ding, and as I watched the floor numbers count down toward ground level, I realized something that surprised me. I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I was free. You know how they say revenge is a dish best served cold? Well, let me tell you something about that particular piece of wisdom. It's absolutely true, but what they don't mention is that the best revenge isn't actually revenge at all. Sometimes the most satisfying outcome is just watching the universe handle your enemies for you while you're busy building a better life somewhere else. It's been 6 months since I walked out of Clara's conference room, and I've got to say, the view from my new reality is pretty damn spectacular. I'm sitting in my new office, not the cramped downtown shoebox I'd been hiding in during the divorce proceedings, but a legitimate office with windows that actually open and a coffee maker that doesn't sound like it's having an existential crisis every time I use it. The sign on the door reads, "Hail Project Solutions," and business has been better than I ever imagined possible. Turns out, when you spend 3 years married to one of the most connected women in the city's business community, you pick up a few contacts of your own. And when those contacts hear that you're newly single and available for freelance project management work, and they've always thought you were the brains behind some of Clara's more successful ventures anyway, well, let's just say my phone started ringing pretty much the day after the divorce was finalized. The irony is beautiful, really. Clara used to joke that I was her secret weapon in negotiations, the guy who could spot problems before they became disasters and keep complicated projects running smoothly. She thought she was being complimentary, but what she was actually doing was advertising my skills to every major player in Manhattan's business scene. Now those same people are my clients, and I'm making more money in 6 months as a consultant than I made in 2 years as a salaried project manager. Turns out my middle-class work ethic and attention to detail are pretty valuable commodities when they're not being overshadowed by someone else's trust fund and family connections. But the real satisfaction isn't the money or the success or even the vindication of knowing I was right all along. The real satisfaction is watching Clara's empire crumble in real time while I'm building something solid and sustainable with my own 2 hands. The news started trickling in about a month after I left. Dave from my old job called me up, barely able to contain his excitement as he filled me in on the latest gossip from the Manhattan business community. "Dude, you're not going to believe this," he'd said, "but Clara's company is imploding. The fraud investigation, the missing money, the bad press. Investors are bailing left and right. It started with the banks. Once they realized the extent of Sabrina's financial crimes, they began calling in loans and freezing accounts faster than you could say embezzlement. Clara found herself dealing with the kind of cash flow problems that would make a small business owner break out in cold sweats, except she was trying to manage it while running a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. Then came the clients. Wealthy people don't like uncertainty, and they really don't like doing business with companies that make headlines for all the wrong reasons. When news broke that Whitmore Luxury Real Estate CEO had been systematically robbed by her own sister for nearly 2 years without noticing, it didn't exactly inspire confidence in Clara's business judgment. The shareholders were next. Board meetings turned into bloodbaths, with investors demanding explanations Clara couldn't provide and answers she didn't have. How do you tell a room full of people who trusted you with their money that you were so busy listening to lies about your husband that you completely missed the fact that your sister was stealing them blind? The final nail in the coffin was the regulatory investigation. When federal agencies start looking into your business practices, it doesn't matter how innocent you are. The mere existence of an investigation is enough to scare away anyone who might have been willing to stick around through the financial problems and the bad press. Within 4 months, Clara had gone from Manhattan real estate royalty to just another failed SO, looking for a buyer willing to take over her debt-ridden company for pennies on the dollar. The personal toll was even more spectacular to watch from a distance. Clara had to sell the penthouse, the same penthouse she'd thrown me out of with such righteous certainty. She downsized to a modest apartment in Queens, which must have felt like being exiled to Siberia for someone who'd spent her entire adult life living in Manhattan luxury. The social circle she'd cultivated so carefully over the years evaporated overnight. Turns out, when you're no longer useful to people who only valued your connections and your ability to host expensive dinner parties, those friendships disappear faster than free drinks at a wedding reception. But the real kicker, the absolute cherry on top of this poetic justice Sunday, was what happened to Sabrina. My lawyer kept me updated on her legal proceedings with the kind of professional glee usually reserved for people who'd just won the lottery. Federal charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement across state lines. The kind of charges that come with mandatory minimum sentences and the distinct possibility of spending the next decade explaining to federal prison inmates why you thought stealing from your sister was a reasonable career choice. Sabrina tried to make a deal, of course. She offered to testify against Clara, claiming that her sister had been complicit in the financial schemes all along. But here's the problem with being a pathological liar who's spent years manipulating everyone around you. When you finally need people to believe you, you discover that your credibility account is completely overdrawn. The prosecutors weren't interested in her testimony because they couldn't trust anything that came out of her mouth. Her own defense attorney reportedly described her as the least reliable witness in the history of federal criminal proceedings. And Clara, despite everything Sabrina had put her through, refused to throw her sister completely under the bus, which meant Sabrina couldn't even get a deal by fully cooperating. She got 8 years in federal prison, and from what I hear, she's not adjusting well to life without credit cards and personal shoppers. Clara tried reaching out to me a few times during those chaotic months. Voicemails that started apologetic and gradually became more desperate as her situation deteriorated. Text messages that ranged from, "I hope you're doing well," to "Please, I need to talk to someone who understands what really happened." I ignored every single one, not out of spite, though I'll admit spite played a small role in my decision-making process. I ignored them because I genuinely had nothing to say to her. What was I supposed to do? Offer comfort to the woman who destroyed our marriage based on lies? Provide business advice to someone who demonstrated such spectacularly poor judgment? Pretend that 3 years of my life hadn't been wasted on someone who valued her sister's manipulation over her husband's honesty? The final paperwork for our divorce was signed on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after she'd thrown me out of the penthouse. I met her at the courthouse, neutral ground, lawyers present, everything official and impersonal. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by months of stress and financial pressure, and the kind of social isolation that comes from being publicly humiliated in a very small, very gossipy business community. "Marcus," she said as we waited for the judge to process the final documents, "I want you to know that I understand now. About everything. About what she did to us. About what I did to us. I understand that I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too proud and too stupid to see what was right in front of me." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no residual affection. She was just a stranger who happened to share some unpleasant history with me. "I know you do," I said quietly, "but understanding what you did wrong doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't give me back the 3 years I spent married to someone who was willing to believe the worst about me without evidence. It doesn't change the fact that when our marriage was tested, you chose your sister over me. If I could take it all back. But you can't, I interrupted gently. And that's the point, Clara. Some mistakes don't get do-overs. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. Some relationships, once destroyed, can't be rebuilt. The judge called our case, and we went through the final formalities of legally ending what had once been the most important relationship in both our lives. Signatures, stamps, official declarations that Marcus and Clara Hale were no longer married, no longer legally bound to each other, free to pursue separate futures. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year, genuine happiness. Not the bitter satisfaction of watching your enemies destroy themselves, not the grim pleasure of being proven right about everything, but real, honest-to-God happiness about what came next. I had a business that was thriving, friends who actually valued me for who I was instead of what I could provide, and for the first time in my adult life, a future that belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, I can honestly say that getting thrown out of that penthouse was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the pain or the humiliation or the months of legal battles, but because it forced me to discover that I was stronger, smarter, and more capable than I'd ever given myself credit for. Clara's world collapsed because she built it on a foundation of other people's money and other people's lies. My new world is solid because I built it myself, one honest client relationship and one successful project at a time. And when I signed those final divorce papers, I didn't just end my marriage to Clara Whitmore. I began my life as Marcus Hale, and let me tell you, it's a hell of a lot better than anything I left behind. They say you should never reveal all your cards at once. For 8 long years, I've lived by that rule, letting everyone think I was a struggling nobody. Even my wife, Sophia, the woman I thought I loved, had no idea who I really was. And that night, sitting on the corner of our leather sectional, sipping a glass of water like I didn't have a care in the world, I let them laugh. Sophia, with her flawless curls and that gleaming pearl necklace I bought her, was in her element. She loved playing hostess, especially to her circle of friends. Well, I called them her entourage. They were the type who'd wear designer dresses to a backyard barbecue just to outshine one another. And tonight, they'd found their entertainment for the evening. Me, Daniel, sweetheart, why don't you tell them about your latest job hunt? Sophia cooed, her tone syrupy sweet, but laced with the kind of venom only she could muster. The room erupted in laughter before I could even open my mouth. It wasn't the first time she'd done this, used me as the punchline to her jokes, but tonight she was really going for it. Maybe the new champagne had given her courage. Her best friend, Melissa, chimed in next. Honestly, Sophia, you're so patient. If my husband couldn't hold a steady job, I don't know what I'd do. I mean, it's not like Daniel's even trying, right? She gave me a look that could cut glass, and I forced a weak smile. That's the thing about playing a role. You have to commit, even when it stings. Inside, I wanted to laugh in their faces, to tell Melissa that her position as head of marketing was courtesy of me. I could see the resignation letter sitting in my drafts folder with her name on it. But I didn't. Not yet. Sophia leaned back, swirling her wine. Oh, Melissa, don't be too hard on him. At least he knows his way around the kitchen. The man makes a mean spaghetti, and someone has to do the dishes around here. More laughter. Even the husbands joined in, their chuckles bouncing off the vaulted ceilings of the house I paid for. The house they thought belonged to Sophia, courtesy of her supposed financial contributions. Funny how none of them noticed the cracks in her story. Did they think her part-time charity work funded this marble-floored palace? Or the luxury cars parked out front? No, but they believed what they wanted to believe because it was easier. And I let them. Sophia wasn't done yet, though. Remember that one time Daniel thought he could be a consultant? Oh, darling, you spent months preparing for that interview, didn't you? What was the company called again? Oh, right, Summit Innovations. They didn't even call him back? She erupted into laughter, clutching her sides like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. That one hit close. She didn't know it, but that interview wasn't what she thought. It had been my routine quarterly check-in, an undercover review to ensure my managers were doing their jobs. I sat across the table from my own hiring team that day, silently judging them while they judged me. It was my way of keeping things in check. And now, my own wife had turned that into a joke. The rest of the night passed in a blur of cruel remarks, shared glances, and clinking glasses. They didn't see the way my grip tightened around my drink or notice the fire building behind my calm expression. That's the funny thing about people like them. They assume the quiet ones are weak. But weakness isn't silence. Weakness is thinking your throne is secure when it's built on lies. Eventually, Sophia waved me off to the kitchen, saying, "Be a dear and get us another bottle, won't you?" I stood and did as she asked, my face a mask of quiet submission. But as I walked away, I caught the words she whispered to Melissa. "Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can do this. A man without ambition is just embarrassing." Embarrassing. That's what she called me. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I swallowed it down. That night wasn't about reacting. It was about remembering. Every word they said, every laugh they shared, was fuel for what was to come. As I stood in the kitchen, uncorking another bottle of champagne I'd bought, I glanced at the clock. It was 9:47 p.m. Less than 12 hours until the board meeting. Less than 12 hours until their world came crashing down. Let them laugh tonight, I thought, because tomorrow, none of them would have anything to laugh about. I returned to the living room, placing the bottle on the coffee table like a dutiful husband. Sophia barely acknowledged me, too busy telling the room about her latest spa day. I sat back down, taking my place in the corner, invisible and insignificant in their eyes. But inside, I was smiling. Let them mock me. Let them think I'm nothing. Because when the clock struck 9 the next morning, they'd learn the truth. The man they belittled wasn't just their equal. He was their boss. It wasn't the first time Sophia had embarrassed me in front of her friends, but this night was a masterpiece of cruelty. She wasn't just hosting. She was putting on a show. Every smile, every joke, every exaggerated story was designed to put her on a pedestal and me 6 feet under. "Melissa," she began, swirling her wine like she was born holding a glass of vintage. "You should have seen Daniel last month. He came home so excited. He thought he'd found the perfect job listing." She leaned forward like she was sharing some scandalous secret. "He spent 3 hours on the application, pouring his heart and soul into it. And guess what?" She paused, grinning like a Cheshire cat. "They didn't even bother sending him a rejection email." The room erupted in laughter. I sat there, my face a carefully composed mask, nodding along like I was part of the joke. Inside, I was calculating. Every laugh, every insult. This wasn't just about me anymore. Sophia's friends were executives, middle management, and department heads at my company. They were the very people who prided themselves on being at the top, blind to the fact that their careers hung on the decisions of the man they were mocking. Sophia was relentless. She crossed her legs, flashing her Louboutins, the ones I bought, and gestured dramatically. "Honestly, I've tried everything to help him, you know? I even suggested he try barista work at the cafe down the street. At least he'd get tips." More laughter. Even the husbands joined in, clinking their glasses in agreement. For a moment, I considered saying something. I could have told them that cafe was one of many businesses I'd acquired under a shell company, that the very job she mocked was in a building I owned. But I stayed quiet. Timing was everything, and tonight wasn't the night to shatter their illusions. Sophia's smile widened as she turned her attention back to me. "What do you think, Daniel? Maybe you should listen to me for once." Her tone dripped with condescension, as if I were a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. I shrugged, keeping my voice calm. "Maybe you're right. I'll look into it." She wasn't expecting that. I could see it in her eyes. She thrived on conflict, loved it when I pushed back, just enough to make myself look defensive. But giving her nothing? That threw her off. Still, she recovered quickly, tossing her hair over her shoulder like a queen dismissing a servant. "Good. It's about time." I sipped my water, letting her have the last word. Let her believe she'd won. The truth was, she'd been losing for years. She just didn't know it yet. As the night wore on, Sophia's arrogance only grew. She bragged about her charity work, making sure everyone knew she was the backbone of the family. "It's not easy being the only breadwinner," she said, her voice heavy with false humility. "But someone has to keep the lights on, right?" It took every ounce of restraint not to laugh out loud. "The mortgage? Paid off years ago. The cars? Paid in full. Every single luxury she flaunted to her friends was courtesy of my money, funneled through accounts she didn't even know existed. But to her, I was just the man who couldn't land a job. The irony was almost too good. Sophia's friend, Angela, leaned forward, placing a manicured hand on Sophia's knee. Honestly, babe, you're a saint for putting up with it. If my husband were that useless, I'd have left him ages ago. Sophia sighed dramatically, as if she were carrying the weight of the world. Oh, believe me, I've thought about it. But then I remind myself, I married for love, not ambition. I clenched my jaw, forcing a smile. Love? Was that what she called it? Because from where I stood, her love looked a lot like opportunism. She'd married me thinking I was a stepping stone, a man she could mold into the kind of success she could take credit for. But when I didn't fit the mold, she turned me into a project. Something to fix, or worse, pity. The night dragged on, each conversation more insufferable than the last. They talked about luxury vacations, designer brands, and the importance of networking. I sat there, nodding along, my presence barely acknowledged unless it was to set up the next joke at my expense. Daniel, why don't you grab us another bottle of champagne? Sophia asked sweetly, her smile as sharp as a blade. You know where it is, right? In the wine fridge I bought? The room erupted into another round of laughter. I stood, nodding politely, and headed to the kitchen. My fists clenched as I reached for the bottle, but I forced myself to breathe. This wasn't the time to react. This was the time to plan. As I uncorked the champagne, I glanced at the clock. It was almost 10 p.m. In less than 12 hours, the same people who mocked me tonight would walk into my office, completely unaware that their fates were already sealed. Sophia would wake up in a house she no longer controlled, her circle of friends decimated. And I'd finally step out of the shadows. I returned to the living room, placing the champagne on the table without a word. Sophia didn't even look at me. She was too busy holding court, basking in the glow of her imagined superiority. For a moment, I considered walking away, heading upstairs, and letting them have their fun. But no, I stayed. I watched. I listened. Every word, every insult, every smug laugh was another nail in the coffin of their delusions. They thought they were untouchable. They thought I was powerless. But tomorrow, they'd learn the truth. The man they underestimated wasn't just their equal. He was their boss. And he was done playing nice. They didn't know it, but every laugh, every insult, every sideways glance they threw my way that night was fuel for what I had been preparing for years. The power I held wasn't in flashy displays or loud declarations. It was in patience, in knowing exactly when to strike. I learned that lesson the hard way, long before I ever met Sophia. 12 years ago, I was a different man. Back then, I didn't know what it felt like to be underestimated. I was young, ambitious, and full of hope. My father ran a small electronics business, a family legacy he poured everything into. We weren't wealthy, but we were proud. That pride crumbled the day corporate raiders came in, bought the business for pennies, and dismantled it overnight. I'll never forget the look on my father's face when they shut the doors for good. It wasn't just a business they took, it was his life's work. That moment shaped me. I swore I'd never let anyone take from me what they took from my father. I would build something unshakable, something untouchable. And I did. Summit Innovations wasn't born in a boardroom. It was born in my tiny apartment, where I worked around the clock, teaching myself coding, business strategy, and finance. I started with small contracts, fixing software bugs for local companies, and used every dollar I earned to reinvest in my dream. By the time I was 28, Summit was growing faster than I could have imagined. By 30, it was a powerhouse. And by 35, it was a global leader. But success comes with its own challenges. The bigger you get, the more vultures circle. I'd already had 3 relationships implode by the time I met Sophia. Each one ended the same way. They saw my success as a golden ticket, something they could latch onto and ride to an easier life. So, when I met Sophia, I made a choice. I wouldn't let her see the real me. Not yet. When we met, I was in the middle of a corporate acquisition. I just finalized a deal worth millions. But I walked into that charity gala dressed in a suit I'd had for years and drove a car that wouldn't have looked out of place in a used lot. Sophia caught my eye instantly. She was beautiful, confident, and magnetic. But what stood out most was how she treated me. When she thought I was just a struggling consultant, she was sweet, supportive even. She told me, "You'll find your place, Daniel. Just keep trying." I believed her. I thought maybe, just maybe, she was different. We dated for a year before I proposed. By the time we got married, I thought I'd made the right choice. I moved her into the house she now calls hers, though I didn't tell her I owned it outright. I let her believe we were sharing everything, that we were building a life together. I even transferred money into her account monthly, so she could feel like she was contributing financially. At first, she was kind, but success changes people, or, more accurately, reveals them. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Sophia's patience turned into criticism. Her kind words became thinly veiled barbs. She started using my lack of ambition as a weapon, first in private arguments, then in front of others. I could have stopped her at any time, but I didn't. Instead, I let her think she was in control. I let her believe she was the reason we had this life. I even let her spend money recklessly, knowing every dollar she flaunted came from my hard work. What she didn't know was that I was always watching. I wasn't just building a company. I was building safeguards. Every shell company, every private account, every legal document was designed to protect what I'd built. Sophia had no idea that every extravagant vacation, every luxury car, every designer dress was paid for by Summit Innovations, funneled through accounts she couldn't trace. And she definitely didn't know that her friends, her inner circle of so-called high achievers, were my employees. Sophia's best friend, Melissa, was the head of marketing. Angela ran human resources. Even the husbands, with their tailored suits and smug grins, were senior executives, all handpicked by me. They thought they were untouchable, climbing their corporate ladders, making decisions they thought were theirs. But the truth was, every promotion, every project, every so-called achievement they bragged about at dinner parties was orchestrated by me. I didn't just build Summit Innovations. I controlled it. And they were pawns in a game they didn't even know they were playing. As Sophia and her friends mocked me that night, I thought about the files locked in my study upstairs. Surveillance footage of drunken company events where they let their guards down. Expense reports showing their misuse of company funds. Recorded conversations detailing their questionable business strategies. They thought they were invincible, but they didn't realize they were being watched by someone who had planned for this moment for years. Sophia's mocking voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Daniel, are you even listening?" she said, laughing. "Honestly, I don't know how you expect to get anywhere if you're always daydreaming." I smiled, a small, calculated smile. "You're right," I said. "I should focus more." She nodded, satisfied, not realizing how true those words were. Because while she saw me as the failure in the room, I was the one holding all the power. And tomorrow, when I walked into my own company as more than just Sophia's husband, the illusion she had built would crumble. The truth about power is simple. It's not about how loudly you speak or how much you show off. Real power is quiet. It's patient. It's waiting for the exact moment when the people who underestimate you are at their most arrogant, and then showing them who you truly are. That night, as I carried another bottle of champagne into the living room, I knew I had reached my limit. The humiliation, the laughter, the dismissive looks, it had all added up over the years. But Sophia's final jab, the one she delivered with a smug grin while her friends clinked glasses, was the spark that lit the fuse. "Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can carry this marriage," she said, her voice loud enough to cut through the laughter. "I mean, I love him, but love doesn't pay the bills. I feel like I'm raising a grown child, not married to a man." Her friends gasped, not in shock but in mock sympathy. "You're so strong," Melissa said, placing a hand on Sophia's arm. "I don't know how you do it." "I keep telling her she deserves better," Angela added. "Someone ambitious. Someone who can match her energy." I paused in the doorway, bottle in hand, listening to the chorus of agreement. My grip tightened on the neck of the champagne. I'd heard enough. Every word, every insult, every patronizing comment. They were drilling into me, but not in the way they intended. Each jab didn't weaken me. It fortified me. I was done playing the role of the defeated husband. Tomorrow, I would end this charade. Daniel, are you just going to stand there? Sophia snapped, her tone sharp and impatient. Bring it here already. I forced a smile, walking over and placing the champagne on the coffee table. Sorry about that, I said softly, keeping my voice even. Didn't mean to keep you waiting. Of course you didn't, she said, barely looking at me. You never do. That was it. I straightened up, looking around the room at the people who had spent the entire evening tearing me down. None of them met my eyes. They didn't need to. To them, I was invisible, unworthy of acknowledgement. But tomorrow, they'd be looking at me, really looking at me, for the first time. I'm going upstairs, I said, keeping my voice calm. Big day tomorrow. Sophia didn't even glance at me. Good luck with that, she said, already turning back to Melissa. Maybe this time he'll land something. The words hit like a slap, but I didn't let it show. I walked upstairs to the study, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of their laughter followed me, but I blocked it out. I had more important things to focus on. Inside the study, I locked the door and sat at my desk, taking a deep breath. The calm facade I had worn all night faded away, replaced by the cold determination that had driven me for years. I opened the hidden panel behind the bookshelf, revealing my secure workspace. 3 monitors lit up, displaying live feeds from the company, financial reports, and the personal files I gathered on Sophia and her friends. I started with Melissa, head of marketing. She had been siphoning funds from the department for years, disguising it as event planning expenses. The receipts in my files told a different story. Lavish vacations, personal shopping sprees, even a down payment on a car. It was all documented, every dollar accounted for. Angela was next. As head of HR, she had covered for executives who violated company policies, sweeping harassment complaints under the rug. Her emails, flagged by my team, were filled with thinly veiled threats to employees who dared to speak up. The husbands weren't any better. Greg, the VP of sales, had inflated quarterly figures to boost his bonuses. Scott, in operations, had been leaking proprietary information to competitors. And they all thought they were untouchable. And then there was Sophia, my wife, the woman who claimed to carry our marriage. She didn't work for the company directly, but she had benefited from it more than anyone. She had used my money to fund her image as a successful socialite, hosting charity events and galas, all while belittling me to anyone who would listen. But the part that stung the most was her betrayal. I had the evidence in front of me, messages exchanged with another man, flirtations at first, then full-blown plans for weekends away. She thought I didn't know. She thought I was too blind, too weak to see what was happening right under my nose. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The weight of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the mockery, it should have crushed me. But instead, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't angry. Anger was too simple, too fleeting. What I felt was purpose. Tomorrow wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about taking back what was mine, about reclaiming the life and the company I had built from nothing. Sophia and her friends had spent years tearing others down, using their positions of power to enrich themselves at the expense of those beneath them. They thought they were untouchable, that their titles and connections made them invincible. But they were wrong. So very wrong. I reached for my phone, sending a message to Sarah, my most trusted executive. Everything is in place for tomorrow. Be ready. Her reply came within seconds. All set? They won't see it coming. I closed the hidden panel and leaned back, the faint hum of the monitors the only sound in the room. Downstairs, I could still hear the laughter, the clinking glasses, the sound of their arrogance echoing through the house. But it didn't bother me anymore. Let them laugh. Let them think they'd won. Because tomorrow, the laughing would stop. As I sat there, I thought about my father, about the lessons he'd taught me after his business was destroyed. Success, he'd said, isn't about being loud. It's about being patient. It's about waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment was finally here. I smiled to myself, the calm before the storm settling over me. By this time tomorrow, Sophia and her friends wouldn't just see me differently. They'd finally see the truth. The man they mocked wasn't a failure. He wasn't a joke. He was their boss. The morning of the reckoning began like any other, but for me, it was far from ordinary. The house was eerily quiet as I dressed in a tailored navy suit. One of the few indulgences I kept tucked away for occasions like this. Sophia was still asleep, her careless confidence evident in the way she sprawled across the bed, oblivious to what was coming. For years, I'd let her believe she was in control, but today, I was taking it all back. At exactly 6 a.m., I left the house, stepping into a black town car waiting outside. My driver, Charles, nodded as I slid into the back seat. He didn't ask questions. He never did. But there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes when he noticed my unusually polished demeanor. "To Summit headquarters," I said simply. He nodded and pulled away, the hum of the engine steadying my nerves. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, my most trusted executive and one of the few people who knew the truth about me. "Sarah, boardroom ready. Security briefed. Documentation finalized." Me, "Perfect. Be sure the legal team is on standby." "Sarah, they've been briefed. Good luck." Luck wasn't a factor anymore. Everything had been meticulously planned, every detail accounted for. I leaned back in my seat, watching the city wake up around me. It was almost poetic, the world going about its business, unaware that, in a few hours, 5 people's lives would be irreversibly changed. When I arrived at the office, I entered through the private service entrance. It was one of many perks that came with being the CEO of Summit Innovations, though no one had ever seen me use it. That's how I liked it. Staying in the shadows, observing from a distance, letting my carefully chosen executives think they were running the show. But today, I wasn't staying in the shadows. Sarah was waiting for me in the security office. She handed me a visitor's badge with a faint smirk. Angela Martinez, it read, the fake name I used whenever I needed to go undercover within my own company. "Everything is set," she said, motioning to the monitors displaying live feeds from various parts of the building. "Your wife's friends are already here. Morning meetings are underway." I glanced at the screens, watching as Melissa, Angela, Greg, and Scott arrived one by one, laughing and chatting as if it were just another day. They had no idea what awaited them. "Make sure the security team knows not to intervene unless instructed," I said. "I don't want any disruptions." Sarah nodded. "Understood. What about your wife?" "Sophia." My stomach tightened at the thought of her. She wasn't part of the corporate takedown, not directly. But what I had planned for her was just as thorough. "She'll know soon enough," I said, brushing off the thought. "Focus on the task at hand." At precisely 8:45 a.m., I took my position in the lobby. Dressed in my unremarkable disguise, I watched as the day's players arrived. Melissa breezed in first, her head held high, barking orders into her phone. Angela followed closely behind, pausing to greet the receptionist with a hollow smile. Greg and Scott arrived together, laughing about a round of golf they'd played the weekend before. They didn't notice me sitting there, flipping through a copy of Summit's annual report like a nervous job candidate. That was the beauty of staying invisible. They never looked twice. At 9 a.m. sharp, I made my way to the HR floor for my interview. It was a charade, of course, a test of how deeply the rot had spread. I wanted to see firsthand how my own hiring process had been corrupted under their leadership. Thomas, the HR representative, greeted me with a thin smile, clearly disinterested. "This will be a quick assessment," he said, leading me into a small conference room. Just a few basic skills tests and a short interview. The skills test was almost laughable in its simplicity. I made intentional errors, fumbling with questions I could have answered in my sleep. Through the glass walls, I saw Melissa walking by, glancing into the room with a look of mild disdain. She didn't recognize me, of course. To her, I was just another nobody wasting her company's time. Thomas reviewed my work with a barely concealed smirk. "Well," he said, his tone condescending, "this is interesting. Let's move on to the interview." The panel interview was worse. 3 middle managers sat across from me, their expressions dripping with boredom. They fired off generic questions, barely listening to my answers. At one point, one of them leaned back in his chair and checked his phone mid-sentence. By the time it ended, I had more than enough evidence. The culture they had cultivated was rotten to its core, dismissive, arrogant, and completely detached from the values Summit Innovations was built on. At 10:15 a.m., I made my way to the executive conference room. It was time for the main event. Through the partially open door, I could hear them laughing, their voices carrying the same smug tone I'd endured the night before. "You should have seen her face during the interview," Melissa was saying. "She looked like she hadn't touched a computer in years." "Oh, that's classic," Angela replied, her voice thick with amusement. "No wonder HR keeps rejecting people. Where do these applicants even come from?" My hand tightened on the doorknob, but I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the room, letting the door close behind me with a soft click. Their laughter died instantly as they turned to face me. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the flicker of recognition as they tried to place me. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and deliberate, "I think it's time we had a real conversation." Melissa blinked, her brow furrowing. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" I smiled, taking a seat at the head of the table, the seat that had always been mine. "I'm Daniel Carter," I said, "CEO of Summit Innovations. And as of this morning, your boss." The room fell silent, their faces a mix of shock, disbelief, and fear. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Let's begin." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Melissa's confident smirk faltered first, giving way to confusion and then panic. Angela looked as if she'd seen a ghost, while Greg and Scott sat frozen, their bravado evaporating as realization crept in. I let the tension build, savoring the moment. They didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or beg for forgiveness. Melissa recovered first, or at least tried to. "Is this some kind of joke?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You? The CEO? That's impossible." "Impossible?" I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table. "Melissa, you've worked at this company for 6 years, and in all that time, you've never thought to question who signs your paychecks. You never bothered to wonder who approved your promotions or overlooked your creative accounting practices. But let me assure you, it's not only possible, it's the truth." I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. Instantly, the monitors on the walls flickered to life, displaying Summit Innovations' original incorporation documents. There, in bold print, was my name, Daniel Carter, founder and CEO. Beneath it was my photo, a younger version of me, smiling confidently. The same man who now sat at the head of the table, watching their world crumble. "I built this company from the ground up," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "Long before any of you were here. Every policy, every division, every success you've taken credit for, it all started with me." Angela's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But you're," she stammered, struggling to find the words. "Ain't nobody?" I finished for her. "A man who couldn't even land an entry-level position? That's what you all thought, isn't it? That I was just Sophia's failure of a husband, clinging to the scraps of her so-called success." Greg finally found his voice, though it was shaky at best. This has to be a mistake. There's no way you've been running things. We would have known." "Would you?" I raised an eyebrow, tapping my phone again. The monitors now displayed a series of emails, financial reports, and surveillance footage. Each file was damning, a testament to their years of misconduct. "You were too busy inflating sales figures, covering up harassment complaints, and funneling company money into your personal accounts to notice who was really in charge." Scott, usually the loudest of the group, sat pale and silent. I turned my attention to him. "Scott, tell me, how's your golf game? Still playing on company time? Using the Summit corporate card to cover your rounds?" His jaw dropped, but no words came out. "And Greg," I continued, turning to the man next to him, "those quarterly sales bonuses you've been bragging about at every dinner party? They're based on fraudulent reports. I have every fabricated number right here." I gestured to the monitors. "Would you like me to show the board?" Greg slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face. Angela tried a different tactic. "Look, Daniel, Mr. Carter. This has been a misunderstanding. I've always respected you. I mean, the company. And if there's anything we can do to fix this..." I cut her off with a cold smile. "Fix it? Angela, you've spent years burying complaints, silencing employees, and fostering a toxic culture. You didn't respect anything except your own comfort." Melissa, ever the opportunist, leaned forward, her tone pleading. "Daniel, we didn't know. If we'd known, we never would've." "Mocked me?" I said, my voice rising slightly. "Laughed at me? Treated me like dirt in my own house?" I stood, planting my hands firmly on the table. "Ignorance isn't an excuse. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You thought I was beneath you. And now, you'll face the consequences." I tapped my phone one last time, and the screen behind me changed again. This time, it displayed their termination letters, each one signed and dated. "Effective immediately, you're all fired. Your access to company accounts and systems has been revoked. Security is waiting outside to escort you off the premises." "No, no, no," Greg muttered, shaking his head. "You can't do this." I locked eyes with him. "I just did." Angela stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "This is outrageous. We'll sue." You'll what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "Sue me for firing you with cause? For exposing the fraud, the theft, the harassment you've swept under the rug? Be my guest, Angela. But I promise you, I have more evidence than you have excuses." The door opened, and 2 security guards stepped inside. "Take them to HR for their exit interviews," I said, my tone icy. "Make sure they understand the terms of their severance, or lack thereof." One by one, they stood, their confidence shattered. Melissa glared at me as if her anger could undo everything. Angela looked like she was holding back tears. Greg and Scott shuffled out without a word, their heads hanging low. Just as they reached the door, I called out, "Oh, and one more thing." They turned to face me, hope flickering in their eyes. "Don't bother reaching out to competitors. Your non-compete agreements are still in effect. And trust me, I'll be watching." The guards escorted them out, and the door closed behind them with a satisfying finality. For a moment, the room was silent again. I let out a slow breath, the weight of years lifting off my shoulders. Sarah entered moments later, her tablet in hand. "Well," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "That went about as expected." "Good," I replied, straightening my suit. "Now, let's prepare for the board meeting. There's still work to do." As I walked out of the room, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, I wasn't just the man behind the scenes. I was Daniel Carter, CEO of Summit Innovations, and I had just reminded them all exactly who I was. I don't think anyone truly understands the satisfaction of watching the mighty fall until it's their hand holding the lever. As I walked back to my private office, I replayed the looks on their faces in my mind. Melissa, Angela, Greg, Scott. They thought they were invincible, untouchable. But I'd torn away their illusions in a matter of minutes. And now, it was time for the aftermath. Sarah was already waiting for me when I arrived, her tablet filled with updates and reports. "The termination process is underway," she said, her tone brisk but professional. "HR is processing their files, and security is clearing their offices." Melissa tried to call someone from the marketing team on her way out, but we've already disabled her phone and email access. I nodded, sitting behind my desk. "Good. Make sure all communications are monitored. I don't want any attempts to leak information or contact clients." "Already done," Sarah replied. "And one more thing. Angela demanded to see the board before she left. She claims she's being wrongfully terminated." I smirked, leaning back in my chair. Wrongful termination? Angela covered up harassment cases, manipulated HR records, and created a culture of fear. Let her try to spin that. I doubt the board will be sympathetic. Sarah smiled faintly, a rare crack in her usually stoic demeanor. "I didn't think so, but I figured I'd let you know." By noon, the fallout was well underway. Security cameras showed Melissa pacing the parking lot, shouting into her phone. Greg sat slumped on the curb, staring at the ground. Scott had already left, his face pale and his shoulders hunched as he walked toward his car. Angela, of course, had been escorted out kicking and screaming, her righteous indignation falling on deaf ears. It was a fitting end for people who had spent years wielding their power to tear others down. And the best part? They still didn't fully understand the scope of what I had done. I pulled up my laptop and opened the live feeds from their exit interviews. Each one was being recorded, of course, for legal purposes. Melissa sat across from the HR representative, her voice tight with anger as she tried to negotiate her severance. "This is ridiculous," she said, slamming her hand on the table. "I've been with this company for years. You can't just fire me." The HR representative didn't flinch. "Your termination is for cause," she replied calmly. "Per your contract, you forfeit severance and stock options under these circumstances. The documentation is all here." Melissa's face turned red as she flipped through the file in front of her. "This is absurd. Cause? What cause?" "Fraudulent expense reports," the representative said, her voice steady. "Unauthorized use of company funds. Gross misconduct." Melissa leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "This isn't over," she muttered. Oh, but it was. Greg's interview was next. He didn't argue as much as Melissa, but his desperation was just as evident. "Look, I know I've made mistakes," he said, his voice low. "But you don't have to do this. I've got a family to support." The HR representative gave him the same calm explanation. "Your termination is for cause. You will not receive severance or stock options." He hung his head, muttering under his breath, "This can't be happening." Angela was the last. True to form, she came in swinging. "This is discrimination," she shouted, pointing a finger at the HR representative. "You can't do this to me. I've done nothing wrong." The representative remained unfazed. "We have extensive documentation of your actions, including emails, recorded conversations, and witness testimonies. You were complicit in covering up harassment complaints and retaliating against employees who came forward. That is grounds for immediate termination." Angela sputtered, her indignation turning into disbelief. I want to speak to Daniel." The representative glanced at the camera, then back at Angela. "Mr. Carter has already approved this termination. The decision is final." By the time their interviews were over, their access had been revoked, their emails archived, and their personal belongings packed up and delivered to their cars. Sarah confirmed the process had gone smoothly. "They're officially out," she said, placing her tablet on my desk. "The office feels lighter already." I smiled. It's amazing how much dead weight can drag a place down. But the day wasn't over yet. There was still one more person who needed to face the consequences. Sophia. At 1:30 p.m., just as I was reviewing the final reports from HR, my phone buzzed. It was Sophia. Her name flashing on the screen brought a mix of emotions. Anger, disappointment, and, oddly enough, relief. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I let it ring for a few seconds before answering. "Hello, Sophia." "Daniel," she snapped, her voice sharp and impatient. "What the hell is going on? Melissa just called me. She said you fired her and half the executive team. Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," I said calmly. "Melissa, Angela, Greg, and Scott were all terminated this morning. It was a long time coming." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. "You can't do that," she said finally, her voice trembling. "They're your employees, my friends. You had no right." "No right?" I leaned back in my chair, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at my lips. "Sophia, I own the company. I have every right." Her sharp intake of breath was almost satisfying. What are you talking about? "For 8 years, I've let you believe I was just some aimless, unemployed husband. But the truth is, I built Summit Innovations from the ground up. Every decision, every success, every dollar you've spent came from me. And now, I've finally taken out the trash." "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No," I said coldly. "You lied to yourself. And now, you're about to see what happens when the truth finally comes out." I hung up, leaving her in stunned silence. There was more to say, much more, but that conversation could wait. For now, I had a company to run. When Sophia stormed into the Summit Innovations headquarters later that afternoon, the receptionist didn't even have time to stop her. She marched past the front desk and headed straight for the executive suite, her heels clicking angrily against the polished floors. I was waiting for her, seated calmly at my desk, reviewing the final files from the day's terminations. The door burst open, and there she was, my wife, looking every bit the picture of indignation. Her perfectly styled hair, her designer handbag swinging in her hand, and the fury in her eyes might have intimidated someone else. Not me. Daniel, she said, her voice sharp and demanding. What in the world is going on? I didn't look up immediately. I took my time, finishing the last line of a report before closing the folder and setting it neatly on my desk. When I finally met her gaze, I spoke with deliberate calmness. Good afternoon, Sophia. What brings you here? What brings me here? She repeated, her voice rising. I just got a call from Melissa, crying hysterically, telling me you fired her, and Angela and Greg and Scott. You've lost your mind. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. Have I? Or have I finally decided to clean up the mess they've made of my company? Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the words. Your company? She scoffed, shaking her head. What are you talking about? Summit isn't yours. It is, I said, my voice steady. It always has been. For a moment, she was silent, the weight of my statement sinking in. Then she laughed, a bitter, disbelieving sound. This is some kind of joke, right? You're trying to, what? Scare me? Humiliate me? I stood, walking around the desk and stopping just a few feet from her. Do you remember the house we live in, Sophia? The one you've always called our home? I paid for it, outright. And the cars, the trips, the charity galas. You thought your part-time work covered all that? No. Every luxury you've ever flaunted was funded by Summit Innovations. My company. Her face paled, and her hand tightened around her handbag. You're lying. Am I? I walked back to my desk and tapped a button on my laptop. The monitor on the wall behind me lit up, displaying the incorporation documents for Summit Innovations, complete with my name as founder and CEO. You've been living off my success for years, Sophia, and while you were busy mocking me, I was busy building an empire. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. You lied to me, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't lie, I said coldly. I let you believe what you wanted to believe. You saw what you wanted to see. A man you could pity, control, and belittle. You never once stopped to question why everything seemed to come so easily, why the bills were always paid, or why your lifestyle never matched what you thought we could afford. You never cared enough to dig deeper. Her eyes filled with tears, not of remorse, but of anger. You humiliated me in front of my friends. You destroyed them. I raised an eyebrow. Destroyed them? No, Sophia. They destroyed themselves. Melissa was stealing from the company. Angela covered up harassment complaints. Greg falsified sales figures, and Scott leaked proprietary information to competitors. They weren't your friends. They were parasites. Just like you. The word hit her like a slap, and for a moment, I thought she might scream. Instead, she straightened her spine, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity. You've gone too far, Daniel, she said, her voice icy. You think you can just humiliate me like this? You'll regret it. I let out a short laugh. Regret it? Sophia, for years, I've endured your mockery, your condescension, and your utter lack of respect. You made me the punchline of your jokes, parading me around as a failure while you basked in a life I built. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner. Her anger boiled over then. You can't do this to me, she hissed. We're married. I'm entitled to half of everything. I walked back to my desk, opened another folder, and pulled out a stack of papers. I placed them on the table between us and slid them toward her. That's where you're wrong. You signed a prenuptial agreement when we got married. It ensures that everything I built before and during our marriage remains mine. Your entitlement ends today. She stared at the papers, her hands trembling. You're divorcing me, she whispered. I am, I said without hesitation. And before you even think about contesting it, know this. I've already spoken to the best divorce attorneys in the city. None of them will take your case. Your access to the joint account has been revoked, and your spending spree stops now. Her face crumpled as the reality of her situation set in. Daniel, please, she said, her voice breaking. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Save it. Your crocodile tears won't work on me anymore, Sophia. For years, I gave you everything. More than you deserved, and you repaid me with mockery and betrayal. I'm done. She stood there, stunned and silent, as I opened the door. Security will escort you out, I said, motioning to the 2 guards waiting outside. Take whatever dignity you have left and leave. Daniel, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean. Goodbye, Sophia, I said, turning back to my desk. And good luck. You'll need it. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I was free from her manipulations, her lies, and her cruelty. I had reclaimed my life, my company, and my self-respect. Sophia's downfall wasn't just the end of a toxic marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter for me. And as I sat back in my chair, watching the sun set over the city skyline, I knew that this was only the start. The day after Sophia's departure, the atmosphere at Summit Innovations was electric. The toxic fog that had lingered for years was gone, replaced by a sense of hope and renewal. As I walked into the office that morning, employees stopped to greet me, not with the stiff politeness reserved for their supposed CEO's husband, but with genuine smiles and nods of respect. For the first time, they were seeing me for who I truly was, the man who had built this company from nothing. Sarah met me at my office, her ever-present tablet in hand. We've finalized the reorganization plans, she said, her voice steady but with a hint of excitement. The departments affected by Melissa, Angela, Greg, and Scott are already seeing improvements. Productivity is up 25% in some areas. Good, I replied, taking the tablet from her and scanning the data. What about the employees who left because of them? Any word? We've reached out to everyone who filed complaints or resigned due to harassment or discrimination, Sarah said. 12 have already accepted reinstatement offers. The others are considering it. Make sure they know they'll be walking into a very different environment, I said. I want them to feel safe here. Valued. Sarah nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Understood. That afternoon, I held an all-hands meeting in the main auditorium, a first for me. For years, I had avoided the spotlight, preferring to work behind the scenes. But now, it was time to step forward and address the people who had kept Summit Innovations running, even under the shadow of corruption. As I stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. I gripped the edges of the podium, taking a moment to steady myself before speaking. Good afternoon, I began, my voice carrying easily through the microphone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Daniel Carter. I'm the founder and CEO of Summit Innovations. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, but I continued. Over the past several years, I've stayed in the background, observing how this company has grown and changed. And while I've seen incredible talent and innovation, I've also seen things that deeply disappointed me. A culture of fear, favoritism, and dishonesty took root here, and I take responsibility for not addressing it sooner. The room was completely silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on me. But that ends today, I said firmly. The people responsible for that culture are gone. And moving forward, this company will be a place where everyone, regardless of their position, feels valued, respected, and empowered. I outlined our new initiatives. Anonymous feedback channels, enhanced HR protocols, and mentorship programs for employees who wanted to grow within the company. I spoke about accountability and collaboration, about building a culture of trust and innovation. And when I finished, the room erupted into applause. For the first time in years, I felt proud, not just of what I had built, but of what it was becoming. Over the next few months, the transformation was remarkable. Departments that had been bogged down by inefficiency and favoritism began to thrive. Jennifer, a brilliant programmer who had left after being sidelined by Melissa, returned to lead our new AI division. Under her leadership, we filed 5 patents in 6 months, more than the company had in the past 3 years. The Thompson account, one of our largest clients, doubled their contract with us, citing our new leadership and transparency initiatives as key factors. Other clients followed suit, and our revenue soared. But the most rewarding part wasn't the financial success. It was seeing the employees flourish. People who had once been afraid to speak up now shared ideas openly. Collaboration replaced competition. And for the first time, Summit Innovations felt like the company I had always envisioned. As for Sophia and her friends, their downfall was swift and brutal. The evidence I had gathered against them was airtight, leaving no room for retaliation. Melissa and Angela's reputations were in tatters, their misconduct exposed to every potential employer. Greg and Scott faced lawsuits for fraud and breach of contract, their careers effectively over. Sophia, meanwhile, had retreated into silence. She moved out of the house within a week of our confrontation, her pride too wounded to fight me in court. The divorce was finalized quickly, thanks to the ironclad prenuptial agreement. I later heard she was staying with her sister, trying to piece together a life that didn't revolve around appearances and materialism. For a while, I thought about her often, not with anger, but with a strange sense of relief. In the end, she had done me a favor. Her betrayal had forced me to confront the cracks in my life and take back control. And for that, I was grateful. 6 months after the shakeup, I stood in my office, looking out over the city. The skyline was painted in hues of gold and orange as the sun set, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Sarah knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Final numbers are in," she said, handing me a report. "Profits are up 60%. Employee satisfaction is at an all-time high, and the mentorship program has a waiting list." I smiled, setting the report down. "It's amazing what people can accomplish when you get rid of the dead weight." Sarah chuckled softly. "There's one more thing," she said. "The press is still asking for an interview. They want to know how you managed to pull off such a perfect transformation." I shook my head. "Let the results speak for themselves. I'm not interested in publicity." She nodded, turning to leave, but paused at the door. "Any regrets?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. I thought about it for a moment. About Sophia's mockery, the betrayal of her friends, and the years I had spent hiding in the shadows. But then I thought about the company we had rebuilt, the people who were thriving, and the future that lay ahead. "No," I said finally. "No regrets. Just lessons." In the end, revenge wasn't about destroying what was broken. It was about rebuilding something better. And as I stood there, watching the city lights flicker on one by one, I knew that Summit Innovations wasn't just a company anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, redemption, and the power of starting over. And I was ready for whatever came next.